She buried her dearest sister that morning, and when she returned home, the house she had spent her whole life building, her clothes, family photos, and every sacred memento had been thrown out into the front yard like trash. Her daughter-in-law stood at the door, coldly saying, "That room is now the baby room. You can stay in the storage room." 68 years old, just lost her sister, and been evicted from the very house she had bought with blood and tears. If you want to know what happened next, and why the decision she made that very afternoon changed everything forever, subscribe to the channel now so you don't miss the next stories. Like and comment your city or country below. I want to know how far this story has traveled in the world. And don't go anywhere, because this story isn't over yet. It's just beginning. The morning I buried my sister, I wore the same black dress I'd worn to my husband's funeral 11 years before. I remember standing at the graveside holding a single white carnation, Margaret's favorite. Never roses, she always said roses were for people trying too hard, and thinking that I had now lost everyone who truly knew me. My husband Raymond was gone. My parents had been gone for years. And now Margaret, my little sister, the one who used to sneak into my bed during thunderstorms when we were children, was in the ground. I was 68 years old, and I felt every single one of those years in my bones that morning. The drive back home took 40 minutes. My neighbor Dorothy had offered to come with me to the burial, bless her heart, but I told her I needed to do it alone. There's a kind of grief that doesn't want company. It just wants silence and the slow passing of miles. I told myself that once I got home, I would make a pot of chamomile tea. I would sit in the kitchen, the one with the yellow curtains I'd sewn myself in 1987, and I would let myself cry. Really cry. Not the contained, dignified weeping I'd managed at the graveside. The ugly kind. The kind Margaret would have laughed at, gently, and then cried right along with me. That was the plan. What I found instead was my life scattered across the front lawn. I saw it before I'd even turned off the engine. My reading chair, the old blue one with the worn armrest, was sitting on the grass like it had been dropped from a window. Beside it, a cardboard box with the flaps open, and I could see the edge of the quilt my mother had made, the one with the yellow and white squares hanging over the side like a limp flag. Further along the walkway, a garbage bag split at the seam, and inside it, photographs. My photographs. The ones in the frames I'd carried from 3 different houses over 40 years. I sat in the car for a long moment. I thought, this isn't what I think it is. Then I got out of the car, and I walked to the nearest box, and I picked up the framed photograph sitting on top of the pile. It was a picture of Nathan, at age 7, gap-toothed and squinting into the sun, his hand wrapped around 2 of my fingers. I had taken that picture at the state fair the summer Raymond got his promotion. I set it back down, very carefully, and then the front door opened. Vanessa stepped out onto the porch. She was wearing a cream-colored blouse I'd never seen before, her hair done, her expression arranged into something that was meant to look apologetic, but landed somewhere closer to inconvenienced. She was my son's wife. She had been my son's wife for 6 years. I had attended their wedding, helped them move into their first apartment, loaned them money twice without being asked twice. "Evelyn," she said. Not Mom. Not anymore, apparently. "Vanessa." I heard my own voice like it was coming from somewhere outside my body. Very flat, very still. "What is all of this?" She came down 2 porch steps, arms crossed loosely in front of her. "We've been meaning to talk to you about this for a while. Nathan and I, we've been doing some planning, and with the baby coming, there's a baby coming? Well, we're planning for one. We want to start trying soon, and we need the space, Evelyn. We need the bedroom." She said it like she was explaining something obvious to someone who was being deliberately slow. "We had the storage room cleared out. It's actually decent sized once you get everything out. We put a cot in there for now, and you'd have a window. It's not—" "You went into my bedroom," I said. "It's Nathan's house. It is not Nathan's house." The words came out quiet. Too quiet, maybe. Vanessa blinked. "Well," she said, and she recalibrated, shifted her weight. "Legally, these things are— Where is my son?" She paused. "He's inside. He thought it would be better if he sent you out here." She didn't answer that, which was an answer. I looked past her at the front door, half open, and I felt something shift in my chest. Not break. It had already broken that morning, standing in the cemetery. This was something different. This was the specific feeling of realizing you have been a fool, and that the foolishness cost you more than you understood. I had spent 40 years working, 30 of them in the same school district, first as a teacher's aide, then as an administrative coordinator, then as the woman everybody called when the district's health insurance stopped making sense. I had raised 3 children largely alone after Raymond's illness, took most of his working years from him before it finally took him altogether. I had budgeted and saved and done without, many times over, so that Nathan and Clara and Michael would have what they needed. Not everything they wanted, but what they needed. I was proud of that. And I had bought this house. With my own money, my own name on the deed, my own signature at the closing, 14 years ago. Because Raymond was already gone by then, and I decided I wanted a garden and a room with enough wall space for bookshelves. Evelyn, Vanessa was still talking. This isn't personal, it's just practical. You're retired, you don't need the space the way we... How long has my furniture been outside? She hesitated. We started this morning. This morning. I let that settle. While I was at my sister's funeral, something flickered across her face. Not guilt exactly. Closer to discomfort, the way a person looks when they realize they've made a miscalculation. The timing wasn't ideal, she said. Wasn't ideal. My sister's body was barely in the ground, and this woman had spent the morning throwing my reading chair onto the lawn. I looked at Vanessa for a long moment, really looked at her. The careful blouse, the practiced expression, the slight tilt of her chin that meant she'd already decided how this conversation was going to end, and she was just waiting for me to get there. Then I bent down and picked up the quilt. I folded it, slowly, the way my mother had showed me when I was 12 years old. You fold from the corners first, she used to say, so the middle stays clean. Vanessa, I said, still looking at the quilt. Yes? If you're cleaning out what you think is useless. I smoothed the last fold with the flat of my hand. Then I suppose it's time I clean out what no longer belongs in my life. She didn't say anything. I carried the quilt inside. What? Nathan was in the kitchen. He was standing by the counter with a cup of coffee, not drinking it, just holding it, staring at the middle distance with the look of a man who had been rehearsing something and suddenly forgotten all his lines. When I walked in, he said, "Mom, don't." I set the quilt on the kitchen table. Not yet. I know this looks bad. Nathan. I said his name the same way I'd said it when he was 16 and had done something he couldn't fully explain. There's a register mothers hit without thinking that lands differently than any other tone in the world. He stopped talking. I want to ask you one question, and I want the truth. He swallowed. Okay. Did you know she was going to do this today, while I was at the cemetery? The silence that followed told me everything. His mouth opened, closed. He looked at the coffee cup. He looked at the window. He looked everywhere except at me. I told her maybe we should wait until... So, yes. Mom, it wasn't supposed to happen exactly like... Yes or no, Nathan? He closed his eyes. Yes, he said. I knew. I stood there in the kitchen where I had made him breakfast for the first 18 years of his life, where I had packed his lunches and checked his homework and held him while he cried after the first girl who broke his heart. I stood in the kitchen with the yellow curtains I'd sewn myself, in the house with my name on the deed, and I looked at my son, and I understood something I hadn't wanted to understand for a very long time. He had let her. Not just today. For a long time. He had let her redirect the holidays, let her pull back on the family dinners, let her make small comments that chipped away at my place in the house, until I'd started asking permission before I walked into certain rooms. I had noticed each instance and told myself I was imagining things, told myself that marriages require adjustments, told myself that Nathan loved me even when his actions looked like something else. I had been lying to myself because the truth was too sad to hold. I need to lie down, I said. Mom, not in the storage room. I picked up the quilt from the table. In my bedroom. Tonight, I sleep in my bedroom. We will talk tomorrow. He didn't stop me. I did not sleep. I lay on top of the covers in the dark, holding the quilt, and I thought about Margaret. I thought about the way she used to laugh, big and undignified, the kind of laugh that made strangers turn around and smile without knowing why. I thought about how she had told me 2 years ago, during one of our Sunday phone calls, "Evelyn, you give too much. You always have. People take what you offer and then they look around for more. I had laughed it off. I told her she was being uncharitable about Nathan. She hadn't argued. She'd just gone quiet in that particular way she had. The way that meant she was letting me be wrong because she loved me, and she knew I'd get there eventually. I got there eventually. Around 2 in the morning, I got up and I turned on the lamp and I opened the small drawer in my nightstand. Under a paperback and a sleeve of cough drops, there was a business card. Cream-colored, embossed lettering. Daniel Whitmore, attorney at law. He'd handled the closing on this house. He'd also helped me update my will 3 years ago, after Raymond's estate finally settled. I held the card, and I thought about Vanessa's face on the porch, the blouse she'd never worn before. Expensive, I thought, and then set the thought aside. The way she'd referred to the house. Nathan's house. Something in that phrase had snagged in my mind and hadn't let go. Nathan's name was not on the deed. I was certain of that. I had been the only buyer. I had written every mortgage check. Nathan had lived here with me for the past 4 years, first alone, then with Vanessa after they married, and in all that time I had never sat down with a lawyer and made any formal changes to how the property was held. I had simply let them live here, the way mothers do, without documentation, without conditions, on the assumption that it did not need to be written down because it was family. Family. I set the business card on the nightstand. Then I reached for my phone and I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I opened my banking app. I used to check it regularly, every week, then every few weeks, then less and less as the years went on because the money was there and the bills were paid, and I had stopped watching closely the way you stop watching closely when you trust the people around you. The balance stopped my breath. I had to look at it twice, 3 times. I opened the transaction history and I started scrolling, and the further back I scrolled, the sicker I felt. Transfers I hadn't authorized. Withdrawals I didn't recognize. Charges on my debit card at stores I'd never been to. A furniture outlet in the next county. Over $2,000, 10 months ago. A home goods store, $1,800. A clothing boutique I'd never heard of. 6 months of charges, 7 months, 8. All of them amount small enough that I might not notice any single one, but together, they built into something that made my hands shake. I set the phone down on the quilt. I sat very still in the lamplight for a long time. Then I picked the phone back up, and I pulled up my contact list, and I found Daniel Whitmore's number. It was 2:30 in the morning. I left him a voicemail that lasted 4 minutes, my voice steady throughout. I was surprised by that. The steadiness. I hadn't known I still had it in me. I explained what I'd found. I asked him to call me first thing. Then I lay back down and I held the quilt, and I thought about my mother's hands making it, square by square, patient and precise, the way she did everything. My mother had buried a husband too, had raised children and held herself together through seasons that should have broken a person. She used to say, "The ground doesn't shift under your feet until you stop paying attention to it." I had stopped paying attention. I was paying attention now. The next morning, I was up before either of them. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table with the deeds folder from the filing cabinet in my closet. It was still in my closet. They hadn't gotten to that yet. And I spread the documents out in front of me. I was still sitting there when Nathan came downstairs at 7, bleary and uncomfortable, and stopped in the doorway when he saw the paperwork. "Morning," I said. He stared at the folder. "What are you doing?" "Having coffee." I wrapped both hands around my mug. "Sit down, Nathan." He sat. He'd always sat when I said it that way. Some habits from childhood never fully leave a person. "I want to ask you about the bank account," I said. He didn't answer right away. He reached past me for the coffee pot, refilled a mug, held it. I watched his face do something complicated. "The joint account?" he said. I had added Nathan to one of my accounts 3 years ago, after I'd had a brief health scare. A false alarm, it turned out, but it had made me want someone who could access things quickly if something happened to me. I had added him for emergencies, that word specifically. Emergencies. "That's the one," I said. He looked at the table, at the coffee, at the window. The same sequence he'd run through last night. "Vanessa needed," he started. "I'm not asking about Vanessa. I'm asking about you." I set my mug down. "You saw the statements. You saw the money coming out. You watched it happen." The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had heard in a very long time. "I thought you wouldn't," he began, and then he stopped. "Wouldn't what?" He couldn't finish it. He just sat there, my son, 41 years old, unable to finish the sentence. I thought you wouldn't notice. That was what he couldn't say out loud. I looked at him, really looked, the way I had looked at Vanessa on the porch. And I saw something I hadn't let myself see clearly before. He was not a bad man, Nathan. He was a weak one. There is a difference, and the difference matters, but in practice it can hurt you just the same. Weak men make the same choices as bad ones, just with more discomfort on their faces afterward. My phone buzzed on the table. Daniel Whitmore's name lit up the screen. I stood up. I have to take this. I walked into the hallway, and I answered, and I talked to Daniel for 20 minutes while Nathan sat in the kitchen with his coffee cooling in front of him, and the ownership document spread out between us like a map of everything he had forgotten to consider. Before I hung up, Daniel said, "Evelyn, I want you to listen to me carefully. Do not move anything out of that house. Don't transfer anything. Don't pack anything. Don't agree to anything. Can you do that?" "Yes," I said. "Good. Come see me tomorrow morning. Bring your bank records if you can print them. And don't say anything to them about this call." I thanked him and put the phone in my pocket. Then I walked back into the kitchen, sat down, and picked up my coffee. Nathan looked at me like a man standing on ice that has just begun to crack, hearing it, but not yet sure where. "Mom," he said, "we should talk." "We will," I said. "We have plenty of time." I did not tell him about Daniel. I did not tell him what I had found in the bank statements. I sat in my kitchen, in my house, and I drank my coffee, and I let the silence do its work, because sometimes silence is the most powerful thing a person has left. And I was done giving things away. Daniel Whitmore's office was on the third floor of a building downtown that smelled like old paper and floor wax. The kind of smell that used to make me feel safe when I was young because it reminded me of libraries. I had not been inside a library, or a law office, in a long time. I had not needed to be. I had spent years assuming that the people around me were handling things the way people who love each other handle things, carefully, with some basic decency. I walked in at 9 in the morning carrying a manila folder with 30 pages of printed bank statements, my original deed documents, and a small notebook where I had written down every transaction I didn't recognize, dated and totaled in a column on the right side of the page. I had been up since 4 doing it. My handwriting was worse than usual, a little cramped, a little uneven, but the numbers were right. I had checked them 3 times. Daniel was already at his desk when his assistant showed me in. He was in his late 60s, gray at the temples, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead the way he always wore them when he wasn't actively reading. He'd been practicing law for over 30 years. He was not the kind of man who rattled easily, and when I'd worked with him on the house closing and later on the will, I'd appreciated that about him. I needed it now more than ever. He stood when I walked in, which he always did, and he came around the desk and shook my hand with both of his. "Evelyn," he said, "I'm glad you called. I'm sorry it was 2:30 in the morning." "Don't be." He gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Sit. Let me see what you've brought." I sat. I set the folder on the desk between us, and I opened it, and for the next 40 minutes I walked him through everything while he listened without interrupting, which is one of the things you pay a good lawyer for. When I was done, he took the bank statements and went through them himself, slowly, the reading glasses down on his nose now, one finger moving along the columns. The office was quiet except for the sound of pages turning, and somewhere down the hall, a copier running. Finally, he set the papers down and looked at me over the rims of his glasses. "How much total?" he said. $31,460. I had written the number in the front cover of the notebook, circled twice. "Over approximately 19 months. He was quiet for a moment. "And your son had authorized access to this account. I added him 3 years ago, after my cardiac scare. I wanted someone who could reach the money if something happened to me." I folded my hands in my lap. I did not give him permission to use it as a personal fund. No written agreement stating that. No, it was family. I said the word the same flat way I'd been saying it to myself for the past 2 days, like pressing on a bruise to confirm it was still there. I assumed that was enough. Daniel set his glasses on the desk and rubbed his eyes briefly. "Okay, here's where we are. Joint account access is a complicated area. He could argue he believed the funds were available to him. What matters is establishing that there was no agreement, no understanding, no communication that this was shared money. He looked at me. Was there ever a conversation, any conversation, where you suggested he could draw from this account? Never. Did he ever ask? Never. Did he ever show you receipts, tell you what the money was spent on, treat it as something he owed you or intended to repay? I thought about it carefully. I owed Daniel accuracy, not the answer I wanted to give. No, nothing like that. There was never a word about it. He nodded slowly. Then we have something to work with. It won't be fast and it won't be simple, but the pattern here, he tapped the bank statements. This is not one or two emergency withdrawals. This is systematic, regular. This is someone who got comfortable. He picked up the deed. Now, the house. Still in my name. It is. I pulled the record this morning after your voicemail. He turned the document toward me and pointed to the ownership line. Evelyn Marie Harper, sole owner, no transfer, no quitclaim deed, nothing recorded. He paused. Did you ever sign anything at all, related to the property in the last few years? Any document Nathan or Vanessa put in front of you? I thought about it. Really thought. There had been a moment, maybe 2 years ago, when Vanessa had handed me a form she said was something to do with homeowners insurance. Updating the coverage, she'd said, routine, just needs your signature here, here, and here. I had signed without reading closely. I had been in the middle of making dinner and she had set it on the counter beside me and handed me a pen and I had signed. I told Daniel this. He wrote it down. Do you remember the name of the insurance company? I don't. I'm sorry. That's all right. We can find it. He made a note. It's possible it was exactly what she said it was. It's also possible it wasn't. We'll check. He set his pen down and looked at me directly. Evelyn, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly, not kindly. All right. Is there any part of you that wants to protect Nathan in this? That would pull back if what we find turns out to be worse than you think? The question landed harder than I expected. I sat with it for a moment. There are parts of me that love him, I said finally. That probably won't stop no matter what. But no. I looked at Daniel. I am 68 years old. I worked for 40 years. I lost my husband, I raised 3 children, and I just buried my sister. And the morning of the burial, while I was standing at a graveside, someone was inside my house throwing my things onto the lawn. I took a breath. I am done protecting people who are not protecting me. Daniel held my gaze for a moment. Then he nodded, once, and he reached for his pen. Good, he said. Then let's get to work. I drove home with a second copy of the deed folded in my purse and a list of things Daniel needed me to do. Take photographs of everything that had been moved or removed from the house. Write down, from memory, every item I could identify as missing or damaged. Do not confront Nathan or Vanessa about any of this. Do not mention the attorney. And if at all possible, try to get access to the room that had been my bedroom and look for anything that seemed out of place, papers, documents, anything Vanessa might have removed from my files. That last one was harder than it sounded, because by the time I got home, Vanessa had put a lock on the bedroom door. Not a heavy lock, just one of those push-button privacy locks you can buy at any hardware store for $12. But it was on the outside of a room in my house, and the implication of it sat in my stomach like a stone. I stood in the hallway and looked at it. Then I went to the kitchen, made myself lunch, and ate it, standing at the counter. Because the truth was, I didn't want to sit at the table and look at the empty chairs and feel the specific loneliness of being unwanted in your own home. Some things you eat standing up because sitting down would make them too real. Vanessa came home around 2 in the afternoon. She set her bags on the counter. Designer, I noticed now that I was looking expensive, the kind with the quiet logo that's meant to signal wealth without shouting it. And she looked at me with an expression that had been recalibrated overnight. Less inconvenienced now, more careful, like she'd thought about things and decided on a new approach. I think we got off on the wrong foot yesterday, she said. I rinsed my plate. Did we? I know the timing was terrible, with Margaret and everything. I want you to know that wasn't intentional. I dried my hands on the dish towel. I turned around and looked at her. Vanessa, I want to ask you something. She settled slightly, like she was relieved we were going to have a conversation instead of a confrontation. Of course. The form you had me sign 2 years ago, the insurance form. Something shifted behind her eyes. Very quick, very small. If I hadn't been watching closely, I might have missed it. I sign a lot of paperwork, she said. This one was at the kitchen counter. You handed me a pen. You said it was for updating the homeowner's coverage. She was quiet for a moment. I don't remember that specifically. What company did we switch to? I handle a lot of the household paperwork, Evelyn. I'd have to look it up. I'd appreciate that, I said pleasantly. Can you look it up today? She smiled, and the smile was practiced and cool. I'll see what I can find. She did not look it up that day, or the next. I started writing everything down. That night I sat in the storage room, not because I had accepted it as my place, but because I needed to be somewhere she wasn't. And I wrote in the small notebook with the green cover that I'd bought at the drugstore that afternoon. I wrote dates, times, what was said, what wasn't, the insurance form, the bedroom lock, the designer bags, the expression on her face when I'd mentioned the paperwork. I wrote it all down because memory is imperfect, and I was not going to let imperfection save her. And then I started going further back. I sat in that cramped little room with the single window that looked out on the side yard, and I thought about the last 2 years with new eyes. About the times Vanessa had taken my card to run to the store and come back with more than I'd expected and brushed past my questions about the receipt. About the Christmas when she'd shown up with a new television for the living room and said it was on sale, a great deal, and I'd admired it without thinking too hard about where the money came from. About the weekend trip she and Nathan had taken to a resort 3 states away, which Nathan had mentioned casually and which I had understood to mean they had saved up for it, because I had thought we all understood the concept of saving. I had thought a lot of things. I pulled up the bank statements on my phone. I went through them again, this time not just looking at the amounts, but at the dates, and I matched them against my own memory. The TV, the resort, the bags, a kitchen renovation I hadn't asked for, that Vanessa had presented as a gift to the household. The numbers aligned, every single time. What she bought matched what she withdrew, almost to the month. She wasn't careless. She was strategic. That understanding settled into me slowly, the way cold settles into a room when the heat goes out. Not all at once, but gradually, until you realize you're shivering and you don't know exactly when it started. I thought about the pregnancy. The reason this had all started, allegedly. The baby that was coming, the bedroom that was needed, the storage room that was actually decent-sized once you get everything out. I had taken that at face value because why wouldn't I? A baby was a baby. Grandmothers made room for babies. That was just what you did. But something had been pulling at the back of my mind since Vanessa said it on the porch, and I couldn't quite get hold of it until I was sitting in that storage room in the dark, turning everything over, and then it came clear. I had not seen any signs. Not one. No prenatal vitamins on the bathroom counter. No prenatal appointments on the kitchen calendar, where Vanessa usually kept her schedule in tidy, color-coded blocks. No ginger tea, no food aversions, no early tiredness. I had shared a house with 2 pregnant women before, my sister-in-law, and my friend Dorothy's daughter, for a summer. And I knew what early pregnancy looked like. It looked like something. Vanessa looked like nothing had changed. I sat with that thought in the dark for a long time. Then I picked up my phone and I called Clara. My daughter answered on the second ring, the way she always did when I called after 9 o'clock, because she knew I didn't call late unless something was happening. Mom, what's wrong? Clara was 43, lived 4 hours away, worked as a hospital administrator, and had always been the child who asked the most questions and accepted the fewest non-answers. She was not my closest child emotionally. That had always been a more complicated territory between us, 2 strong-willed women in the same family. But she was the most clear-eyed. She saw things straight. I need to tell you some things, I said. It might take a while. I'm not going anywhere. I heard her settle back into whatever chair she was in. Tell me, I told her. Not everything. Not the attorney, not the plan, not the specific numbers, because I was not ready for Clara to mobilize before I had my footing, but enough. The lawn, the storage room, the lock on the bedroom door, Vanessa's face when I asked about the insurance form. Clara was quiet through most of it. She made small sounds that meant she was listening and processing, the same sounds she'd made as a teenager when she was doing math in her head. When I finished, she said, "How long have you been sitting in a storage room?" 3 nights. Mom, Her voice had gone very flat in a way that usually preceded something definitive. You understand that's your house? I do. Does Nathan understand that? I think he's been encouraged to forget it. Another silence. I'm coming up there. Not yet, I said it firmly. Clara, please. Not yet. I need you to stay where you are for now, and I need you to not call Nathan. Why? Because I'm not finished finding things out yet. And if you call him, he'll tell Vanessa, and she'll... I stopped, chose my words. She'll adjust, and I need her to think that nothing is adjusting. Clara was quiet for a moment. I could feel her deciding between the argument she wanted to make and the trust she owed me. Finally, she said, Fine, but you call me. Every day. Every day. And if anything happens, anything, Mom, you call me and I'm in the car. I know. I mean it. I know you mean it. And I did. Whatever else Clara and I had between us, I knew that. After I hung up, I lay back on the cot in the storage room. It was a standard folding cot, the kind you'd find in a church emergency shelter with a thin foam pad. And I stared at the ceiling and I let myself feel it for a few minutes. The full weight of it. The exhaustion and the grief and the specific corrosive humiliation of being a woman who has given everything to the people she loves and discovering that at least one of them has been treating that generosity as a resource to be extracted. I let myself feel it, and then I put it somewhere behind my sternum, and I kept going, because that's what you do at 68 when the ground goes out from under you. You don't wait for someone to come build it back. You find the nearest solid thing, and you stand on it. The nearest solid thing I had was information, so I kept gathering it. The insurance document turned out not to be an insurance document. Daniel called me 4 days after our meeting, on a Wednesday afternoon when Vanessa was out and Nathan was at work, and he told me quietly and carefully that after some research, he could not find any updated homeowner's insurance policy filed in conjunction with a signature matching mine from the period I described. What he had found, filed with the county recorder's office, was an amendment to a power of attorney document that someone had submitted 3 years ago, which had subsequently been withdrawn, apparently when something about it hadn't cleared correctly. The original filing, however, was still in the record. My name was on it. So was Vanessa's. I sat in my car in the grocery store parking lot, and I held the phone against my ear, and I felt something that wasn't quite shock, because some part of me had been bracing for something like this, but was closer to the particular vertigo of having your worst suspicion confirmed. She tried to give herself power of attorney, I said. The document was pulled before it went into full effect, Daniel said carefully. Something in the filing was flagged, possibly a notarization issue, but the intent of the document is clear. It was drafted to give Vanessa Cole authority to make financial and property decisions on your behalf. I said nothing. Evelyn, are you still there? I'm here. My voice sounded oddly detached to my own ears. What does this mean for us? It means that what we're dealing with is not impulsive. This was planned. Someone consulted or researched this process, had a document drawn up, and put it in front of you to sign. A pause. And the only reason it didn't go further is because something went wrong on their end. Not because they had second thoughts, not because they decided it was wrong, because of a notarization error. I sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes after I hung up, watching people push carts to their cars and load their groceries and go about their days, and I thought about what kind of person plans something like that. Thinks through the legal mechanism, finds the form, engineers a moment when a 68-year-old woman is distracted at her own kitchen counter, hands her a pen, and watches her sign away her autonomy. And then I thought about who in my house had the patience, the coldness, and the motivation. And I thought about the pregnancy that showed no signs. And I thought about 6 years of small compressions, the missed holidays, the redirected conversations, the steady erosion of my place in a family I had built with my own hands. And I understood that I had not been watching a marriage that was slightly difficult. I had been watching a long, patient campaign. When I got home that evening, Vanessa was in the living room watching something on the television she'd bought with my money. She had her feet tucked under her on the couch, a glass of wine on the end table, my end table, the one that had belonged to Raymond's mother, and she looked up when I came in with the easy, unbothered expression of a woman who believed everything was still going according to plan. "How was your afternoon?" she asked. "Fine," I said. Quiet. I hung up my coat. I went to the kitchen. I started making dinner because we still all ate dinner together, which had begun to feel like the most surreal part of my days. The four of us, or three of us when Nathan worked late, sitting around a table like an ordinary family while I sat on secrets that were changing shape and growing heavier by the hour. Nathan came home at 6:30. He kissed Vanessa on the top of the head when he passed her in the hallway. She reached up and touched his arm without looking away from the TV. They had the physical shorthand of people who know each other well, and watching it, I felt the complicated truth that I'd been circling for days come into full focus. Nathan was not innocent, but Nathan was also not the architect. He had let himself be managed slowly and thoroughly by a woman who had understood from early on that the best way into this family's finances and property was through the son who would do anything to keep the peace at home. Nathan had always hated conflict. As a child, he would rather apologize for something he hadn't done than sit with someone else's anger. Vanessa, I now understood, had recognized that quality and used it the way a key fits a lock. She had turned my son into a mechanism. That thought was one of the hardest ones I'd had, and I'd had some hard ones. I made pasta. I made a salad. We sat at the table, the three of us, and Nathan talked about something that had happened at work, and Vanessa asked a few questions, and I ate my dinner and I said very little, which no one commented on because in the past several months I had said less and less at dinner, and everyone had simply adjusted to it, which told me something about how invisible I had become in my own house without any single moment I could point to and say, that is when it happened. After dinner, Nathan volunteered to do the dishes, which he sometimes did when he felt guilty about something, and Vanessa went upstairs, and I sat at the table with the last of my water and I thought about what Daniel had told me to look for next. There were items missing from the house, specific items, things that had been in my bedroom and the living room and the hallway that were no longer there. A silver-framed mirror that had been in my family for 2 generations, a set of first edition books that had belonged to my father, not particularly valuable in market terms, but irreplaceable to me. A jewelry box, wooden, handmade, that Raymond had given me on our 20th wedding anniversary and which I had kept on my dresser for the past 22 years. That jewelry box. I had not thought about it in the chaos of the past week, but now that I was thinking about it, I could not remember the last time I had seen it. I waited until I heard the shower running upstairs. Then I went to the bedroom door in the hallway, my bedroom, still locked, and I tried the handle even though I knew it wouldn't turn. It didn't. I looked at the lock for a moment, then I went to my own things, what remained of them in the storage room and in boxes in the hall closet, and I went through them carefully, going through every item, checking. The jewelry box was not there. The silver mirror was not there. The first edition books were not there. I found a list of everything I could identify as missing. I ended up with 14 items from memory alone, and I photographed the spaces where they should have been, the empty dresser, the bare shelves, and I sent the photos to Daniel with a text message that said simply, "More to add to the list. 14 items unaccounted for. Some with significant personal value. We'll call tomorrow." He replied within minutes, noted, "We're building a strong picture. How are you holding up?" I looked at the question for a moment. It was kind of him to ask. It was the kind of question that 2 weeks ago I would have deflected with something reassuring because I had spent my whole life giving people reassuring answers when they asked how I was holding up. I typed back, "I'm angry," which is better than I was a week ago. He sent back, "Good. Hold on to that." I put the phone in my pocket. I went back to the storage room, the cot, the single window, the box of my things stacked against the wall. I sat on the edge of the cot, and I did not think about how humiliating it was to be sleeping in a storage room in my own house. I thought instead about what I still needed to find, about what Vanessa had done with 14 items that didn't belong to her, about whether the jewelry box had already been sold, and whether I would ever see Raymond's handwriting on the card inside it again, the card he had tucked under the velvet liner, which I had found only after he died, which said nothing except for my Evelyn. Always, and whether the woman upstairs had looked at that card or thrown it away without reading it. That was the thought that broke through, finally. Not the money, not the power of attorney, not the locked bedroom or the lawn full of my belongings. It was the thought of that card, discarded, that made my eyes go hot and my throat go tight and my hands clench in my lap. I sat with it. I let it move through me. Then I picked up the green notebook and I kept writing. I was writing every night now, dates, details, things said and unsaid. I had 23 pages already, and the handwriting had improved since the first morning at Daniel's office. Steadier, more precise. Anger has a clarifying effect if you let it work for you instead of against you. I was letting it work. I called Clara the next morning, as promised. "You sound different," she said. "Do I?" "Less, I don't know. Less like you're trying to hold yourself together." A pause. "More like you've already decided something." "I have," I said. "What did you decide?" I looked out the kitchen window at the garden, which needed work. The beds had gotten overgrown in the past few months because I hadn't had the heart for it, and nobody else had touched them. Raymond had loved that garden. He used to say that the best thing about growing things is that they don't care what happened yesterday. They just keep reaching for the light. "I decided that this is still my house," I said, "and I am done behaving like a guest in it." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then, "What does that mean practically?" "It means I have an attorney." Another pause, longer this time. "Mom, how long have you had an attorney?" 10 days. "And you're telling me now?" "I'm telling you now," I said, "because now I know enough to tell you the whole thing." So I did. This time I held nothing back. I told her about Daniel, about the bank statements, about the insurance form that wasn't an insurance form, about the power of attorney that had failed on a technicality. I told her about the missing jewelry box and the mirror and the books. I told her about Vanessa's expression when I asked about the paperwork and the lock on the bedroom door, and the 19 months of quiet, methodical withdrawals that had taken $31,000 out of a savings account I'd built over 4 decades. I told her all of it. Clara didn't say anything for a long time after I finished. I could hear her breathing, slow and even, the way she breathed when she was working very hard to stay controlled. "Clara, I'm here." Her voice was tight. Okay, I'm here." A beat. "Nathan knew about the money?" "He had access. Whether he directed it or just allowed it, I'm not certain yet. But he knew. He knew." Another silence. Then Clara said something I hadn't expected. "Mom, I have to tell you something." I waited. "Vanessa called me. About 3 months ago. She said you'd been having some memory issues. That you were getting confused about finances, forgetting conversations, that kind of thing. She said she and Nathan were worried about you and she wanted me to know in case—" Clara stopped. I didn't believe her. Not completely. But I also didn't call you about it, and I should have. I should have called you immediately. The quiet that followed was the kind that needs a moment before anything can be said into it. "She was laying groundwork," I said slowly. "Yes. If questions ever arose about the finances, if I ever did find out and said something, there would already be a narrative in place. Memory issues, confusion." I felt the cold precision of it settle over me like water. "She told you. Who else did she tell?" "I don't know, maybe Michael." Michael was my youngest, 39, quieter than Clara, lived 2 states over. Less likely to push back than Clara, more likely to worry in silence. If Vanessa had planted the same seed with him, it would have taken root in a different but equally useful way. "I need you to call Michael," I said, "not to alarm him, just to find out if she said anything similar to him. I'll call him today. And Clara." I waited a beat. "Thank you for telling me. I should have told you 3 months ago. You're telling me now." I meant it. There was no room in what I was building for resentment toward the people who were actually on my side. That's what matters. After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The coffee had gone cold, and I didn't bother warming it. I was thinking about the phone call Vanessa had made to Clara 3 months ago, thinking about the calculation behind it, the patience, the planning. You don't make that phone call on impulse. You make it when you've already identified the risk and decided how to neutralize it. You make it because you've thought ahead. I had spent months believing that what was happening to me was a failure of family, a moral weakness, the kind of thing that happens in unhappy households when people stop communicating and start drifting into selfishness. I had told myself it was complicated, that Nathan loved me and was simply confused, that Vanessa was difficult but not malicious, that the truth was somewhere messy in the middle. I didn't believe that anymore. What I was dealing with was not drift. It was direction. Careful, sustained, purposeful direction. Toward a future in which Evelyn Harper had no memory to trust, no property to hold, no children who believed her account of events, and no legal standing to question anything that had been done with her money or her house. I thought about the day she'd handed me that pen at the kitchen counter, the way she'd timed it, the dinner on the stove, the casual hand gesture toward the line that needed my signature, the practiced ease of it. I thought about everything she had tried to take, and then I thought about what she had miscalculated. She had assumed that a 68-year-old woman who had spent her life being gentle and accommodating and easy to manage would stay that way when pushed far enough. She had read 40 years of patience and called it weakness. She had seen a lifetime of giving and called it compliance. She had looked at a woman who had survived grief and loss and 40 years of hard work, who had raised 3 children and buried a husband and stood at her sister's grave without falling apart, and she had decided that woman was soft all the way through. That was her mistake. I was not soft all the way through. I was just done being gentle with people who had stopped deserving it. I picked up my notebook and I turned to a fresh page and I wrote at the top, "What we still need." Then I wrote a list, crisp, methodical, without a single wasted word, of every remaining piece of evidence, every document to recover, every thread to pull. When I finished, I looked at the list for a moment. Then I picked up my phone and I called Daniel. "I need to know," I said when he answered, "whether we can establish where the missing items went, the jewelry box, the mirror, the books, whether they were sold, and if so, where." "We can look at," he said, "resale shops, online platforms, auction sites. It takes time, but it can be done." "Good." I looked at the list. "I also want to talk to you about Vanessa's communication with my other children. Specifically, a phone call made approximately 3 months ago in which she suggested I was experiencing memory issues." A beat of silence. "That changes things." "Yes," I said. "I think it does." I had gone into that storage room a woman who had been thrown away. I was coming out of it something different, something harder and more precise, with a clearer understanding of what had been taken and a clearer picture of exactly how to take it back. Michael called me on a Thursday evening, 11 days after I'd spoken to Clara. I was in the kitchen when the phone rang, standing at the counter with a cup of tea I hadn't touched yet, watching the garden through the window the way I'd been doing a lot lately. Not really seeing it, just letting my eyes rest somewhere that wasn't a person's face. The garden was in worse shape than ever. The rose bushes along the back fence had gone leggy and wild, and the herb bed I'd kept for 20 years had mostly gone to seed. It looked like what it was, something that had been loved and then left without tending. When I saw Michael's name on the screen, I answered immediately. "Hey, Mom." His voice had that careful quality it got when he was working up to something. Michael had always been my quietest child, thoughtful in a way that sometimes read as distant, but was really just slow, deliberate, the kind of person who turns a thing over completely before he speaks about it. He'd been that way since he was 4 years old. "You got a few minutes?" "I have as many as you need." A pause. "Clara called me." "I know. She told me a lot." Another pause. I could hear him exhaling slowly. "Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you not to soften the answer." "Ask." "Did you know that Vanessa called me about 5 months ago?" I closed my eyes briefly. "What did she say?" "She said you'd been struggling, forgetting things, getting turned around with the finances, showing up to appointments on the wrong day. She gave me specifics, Mom. Names, dates. She said she and Nathan were trying to figure out the best way to support you, but that they didn't want to alarm the family." His voice had gone tight. "She said you'd been getting upset when people tried to help, and that sometimes the best approach with, and I'm repeating her words exactly, older adults in early cognitive decline was to manage things quietly until the family could align on a care plan." I stood very still at the counter. "And you believed her," I said. "I didn't know what to believe. I hadn't seen you in 4 months, and when we talked on the phone you seemed like you, but I thought maybe I was missing something. I thought maybe I didn't want to see it." His voice broke just slightly and then steadied. "I should have called you. I should have gotten in the car and come up there and looked you in the eye. Instead, I just..." He stopped. "I let it sit. I told myself I'd figure it out at Christmas." "Michael, I know." She called Clara too. Similar version. I know. Clara told me. His voice shifted into something harder. Mom, she called both of us. She told us both you were losing your mind. While she was... He cut himself off. I heard something that might have been him walking, pacing, the way he did when he was too agitated to stay still. While she was taking your money, we were both quiet for a moment. Michael, I need you to hear something. I'm listening. I'm not angry with you for not calling me sooner. I understand why you hesitated. I know what it's like to be handed information you don't want to be true and to need time with it. I meant every word of that, and I needed him to know it because I could hear the guilt in his voice, and guilt makes people defensive, and I needed him clear-headed. What I need from you now is not an apology. I need you to help me. A long pause. When he spoke again, the guilt had shifted into something steadier. What do you need? Be available, stay informed, and do not contact Nathan or Vanessa about any of this. Done. No hesitation. What else? That's enough for now. I'll call you soon. I picked up my tea, finally. It had gone cold. And Michael, I love you. I love you, Mom. His voice was rough. I'm sorry I wasn't paying better attention. So was I said quietly. We can both do better. After I hung up, I stood in this kitchen thinking about what Vanessa had done with the precision of someone studying a map. She had reached out to both of my other children separately, months apart, and seeded the same story. Cognitive decline. Memory issues. Older adults. She had not said demented or senile because those words would have prompted Clara to act immediately. She'd been smarter than that. She'd used the softer language, struggling, getting confused, hard to reach. The kind of language that worries you but doesn't alarm you. The kind that makes you watch and wait instead of picking up the phone. If I had ever come to Clara or Michael with evidence of what Vanessa was doing, they would already have been primed to doubt me. That was the mechanism. That was what the phone calls were for. Not compassion, not family concern. She was building a wall between me and my own children, one carefully chosen word at a time, before I even knew I needed them. The coldness of it was almost admirable, in the way you might admire the engineering of something dangerous. Almost. I went to bed that night and I did not sleep well, and in the morning I called Daniel and told him about both phone calls. That's significant, he said. Very significant. Attempting to establish a narrative of cognitive impairment in advance of legal action, or in anticipation of being held accountable, that goes well beyond financial mismanagement, Evelyn. That's something else. What's something else? It's consistent with a pattern of elder financial abuse. The systematic nature of the withdrawals, the failed power of attorney, the preemptive discrediting of your testimony to family members. Taken together, this is a documented pattern that courts take seriously. A pause. I want to bring in someone else, a colleague of mine who specializes in these cases. Her name is Patricia Rowe. She's sharp and she doesn't waste time. Bring her in, I said. I met Patricia Rowe the following week in Daniel's office. She was somewhere in her mid-50s, compact, with close-cropped silver hair and eyes that moved over me in the first 30 seconds the way a doctor's eyes move. Quickly, assessing, not unkind but not sentimental either. She shook my hand with a firm grip and said, "Tell me everything. Don't edit." So I told her everything. It took 2 hours. She took notes in a small spiral pad with a mechanical pencil, and she asked questions, sharp, specific questions that cut to the center of things without preamble. When I described the power of attorney document, she stopped me. "The original filing, it was withdrawn, you said." "That's what Daniel found. But the filing itself is in the county record." "Yes." She wrote something down. "Who prepared that document? Do we know?" "We don't yet. We need to find out. If it was prepared by an attorney, there's a record. If it was done through an online legal service, there's still likely a trail." She looked up from the notepad, and he had told himself, along the way, whatever story let him sleep at night, that I wouldn't notice, that it wasn't that much, that Vanessa needed things, and he loved her, and love meant providing, and this was just the path of least resistance. I knew that path. I had watched it destroy people from the inside out. 3 weeks after my meeting with Patricia, on a Saturday morning when the house was quiet and Vanessa was at what she called her wellness appointment, a weekly event whose cost I now knew appeared regularly in my bank statements, I finally got into my bedroom. Not by force, by a hardware store trip the previous Tuesday while Nathan was at work, in which I had purchased a small tool used by locksmiths that could disengage a push-button privacy lock from the outside. It had cost $7. A teenage boy at the store had shown me how to use it in under 2 minutes after I told him I'd locked myself out of my own room. I stood in the hallway with the tool in my hand and I thought, 68 years old and learning to pick locks. Margaret would have found this funny. I thought she probably would have. I opened the door. The room had changed. Not dramatically. The bones of it were the same, the window, the closet, the layout I'd lived with for 14 years. But Vanessa's belongings had moved in the way water fills a space, seeping into every corner. Her dressing table was against the wall where my bookshelf used to be. Her clothes filled the closet. Her shoes were lined up in a row that took up half the floor. I stood in the doorway and I breathed through it. Then I went to work. I was not there to take anything back yet. I was there to document. I moved through the room methodically, taking photographs of every corner, every surface, every place where my things had been replaced with hers. I opened the closet and photographed the interior. I checked the drawers of the dressing table. I did not touch what was inside, just photographed. And in the second drawer I found something I had not expected. A folder. Plain manila, the kind you find in any office supply store. Inside it, papers. I took the folder to the window where the light was better and I went through the contents quickly, not removing anything from the folder, just lifting each page and looking. The first pages were what appeared to be financial printouts, account information that, at a quick scan, did not look like any account I recognized. Not my account. Different numbers, different institution. The next pages were more interesting. They were printed email exchanges between Vanessa and someone whose name I did not recognize. The email address was a personal one, no company name. The exchanges were dated over the past 8 months. I did not have time to read every word, but I read enough to understand the shape of what was being discussed. There were references to property value, references to timing, references to what one email called the old woman's signature and what the response called not a problem, she's easy. I took out my phone and I photographed every page, all 14 of them. Then I replaced the folder exactly as I'd found it, closed the drawer, walked out of the room, and pulled the door shut behind me. I stood in the hallway and I held my phone and I looked at the photographs and I thought, there it is. I called Daniel from my car, parked 3 blocks away because I didn't want anyone to see my expression. I found something, I said. I described the folder. I described the email printouts and the language I'd seen. Daniel was quiet for a moment after I finished. You didn't remove the documents? No. Good. You photographed them in place? Yes. Send them to me right now. I heard him typing. Evelyn, if what you're describing is what it sounds like, a third party involved in this is much larger than a domestic dispute over finances. This is potentially coordinated fraud. I had known, on some level, that the word was coming. I had been circling it in my mind for days, but hearing it said plainly in Daniel's careful, measured voice landed with a different kind of weight. Who is she talking to? I said. We'll find out. A pause. Send me the photos. And then go home and act normal. Act normal. I had been doing that for weeks. I was getting very good at it. I sent him the photos and drove home and made dinner. The confrontation came sooner than I expected, not because I had planned it. Daniel and Patricia and I had discussed timing carefully, and the plan was not to move until we had everything in order. The confrontation came because Vanessa forced it. It was a Sunday. 3 days after I'd been in the bedroom. Nathan's family, his Aunt Carol and her husband, 2 cousins I'd known since Nathan's childhood, and Nathan's oldest friend Marcus, who had been at every major event of Nathan's life for 30 years, had come over for lunch. It had been planned weeks in advance, before everything, back when the 4 of us were still running the pantomime of a functional household. I had considered excusing myself. I had decided against it. This was my house, and these were people I had known for decades, and I would not disappear from my own table. We were midway through the meal when Vanessa said it. She did it the way she did everything, smoothly, in a context that made it seem organic, slipping it in between 2 ordinary sentences like a knife between ribs. Carol had been asking about the house, how things were going, whether we'd done anything to the garden. She knew I loved the garden, and I had said I'd been a bit neglectful of it lately, which was true, and Nathan had said something vague about plans for the spring, And then Vanessa set down her fork and said, in her light conversational voice, "We've actually been talking about some transitions with the house." She looked at Carol across the table. "Evelyn's been finding some things harder lately, managing the property, keeping up with everything. We've been trying to figure out the most supportive arrangement going forward." The table went quiet in that particular way tables do when something has been said that everyone understands, but nobody wants to be the first to acknowledge. I set my own fork down. Carol looked at me with uncertain eyes. She was a kind woman, and she did not know what was happening, and I could see her trying to calibrate between what Vanessa had said and the woman sitting in front of her who looked, by any visible measure, entirely well. "Evelyn," she said carefully, "how are you feeling?" "I'm feeling fine, Carol," I said. "I'm feeling very well, actually." I looked at Vanessa. Vanessa met my eyes without flinching. "What exactly have you been telling people, Vanessa?" Something shifted at the table. Nathan reached for his water glass. "I've just been sharing some concerns," Vanessa said, still in that light tone, that infuriating, practiced ease. "Nathan and I both want what's best for you." "Nathan," I looked at my son. "What concerns has your wife been sharing about me?" Nathan's jaw tightened. "Mom, this isn't the time." "I think it is. These are your family and your oldest friend. I'd like to know what they've been told." I kept my voice even. I had practiced keeping my voice even. "Marcus." I turned to look at Nathan's friend, who was sitting at the far end of the table with the expression of a man who deeply wished he had found a reason to cancel this lunch. "Has Vanessa called you to share concerns?" Marcus looked at Nathan. Nathan looked at the table. Yeah, Marcus said. He had never been a good liar. "She called me a few weeks ago." "And what did she say?" A pause. "She said you'd been having some memory stuff, getting confused." "Getting confused?" I looked around the table, at Carol, whose face had gone careful and still, at the cousins, who were watching like they'd stumbled into something they didn't understand, at Nathan, who was looking at his plate, at Vanessa, who was looking at me with an expression that was working very hard to stay composed. "I'd like to tell all of you something." "Mom," Nathan started. "I am going to speak." I said it quietly, and he stopped. "I have not been confused. I have not been forgetting things. My memory is intact, and my mind is clear." I looked at Vanessa. "What has been happening in this house has nothing to do with my cognitive health and everything to do with $31,000 taken from my savings account, a fraudulent power of attorney document, and 14 personal items removed from my home without my permission." The silence that followed was absolute. Vanessa's expression broke. Not completely, but enough. Something moved across her face that was reflexive, involuntary, the thing underneath the performance that she hadn't meant to let through. Carol said. "I'm sorry, what?" $31,000. I looked at her. Over 19 months, from an account my son had access to for emergency purposes. I turned back to Vanessa. "Your wife has been spending my money, Carol, and 3 weeks ago I found documentation in this house suggesting she may have been doing so in coordination with a third party." I folded my hands on the table. "I have an attorney. I have a specialist in financial elder abuse. I have bank records, photographs, and copies of documents that were filed with the county." Nathan pushed his chair back. "Mom, what are you—" "I'm telling the truth." I kept my eyes on him. "You wanted to wait until everyone was here? This is everyone. These are your people. Let them hear it." He stood up. He looked lost and angry and terrified and something else, something that, underneath all the noise, was close to shame. "This isn't how this should have happened." "No," I agreed. "It shouldn't have happened at all." Vanessa stood up too. "Evelyn, I think you should consider that what you're saying is documented," I said simply. "Everything I've said is documented." She went still. That was the moment. That small, complete stillness. The pause. The recalculation. The fraction of a second in which a person who has been performing confidence runs out of performance and there is nothing behind it. "Nathan," she said. Her voice had changed. Dropped the lightness, the ease, the practiced warmth. She was talking to him now in a register I'd never heard before, flat and urgent and stripped of all the things she usually put between herself and urgency. "Nathan, we need to—" "Don't." He said it without looking at her. He was still looking at me. His face was doing something complicated and painful that I recognized because I had watched that face do complicated, painful things since he was a small boy. Don't. Nathan. Vanessa. He turned to look at her then, and whatever he saw on her face when she ran out of performance must have answered something he'd been asking himself for a while, because he went quiet for a long moment. His throat moved. Is it true? The money? She looked at him. She opened her mouth and I saw her make the calculation. Saw her decide which version of this she could still walk back, still redirect, still reshape into something she could manage. I saw the calculation fail. It's complicated, she said. Nathan sat back down in his chair like the ground had gone out from under him. Marcus said very quietly, to no one in particular, I think I should go. Carol put her hand on his arm. Stay. I looked at my son. He was sitting with his elbows on the table and his face in his hands, and he looked like a man who had been carrying something for a long time and had just put it down in public and was mortified by the size of it. I did not feel the satisfaction I had imagined I would feel. I had imagined, in the privacy of the storage room in those early nights, that this moment would feel like release, like the cork coming out of a bottle that had been under pressure too long. Instead, it felt like grief. The particular grief of watching someone you love discover a truth you'd already been living with for weeks. It felt like watching Nathan catch up to where I already was. Vanessa said, I need some air, and walked out of the dining room. Nobody stopped her. A moment later, I heard the back door open and close. The table sat in its aftermath. Carol reached over and poured herself more water without being asked, the reflex of a woman accustomed to managing difficult moments in communal spaces. The cousins looked at each other and then at their plates. Marcus picked up his fork and set it down again. Nathan finally lifted his face out of his hands. He looked at me. His eyes were red at the rims. Mom, he said, I need to ask you something. Ask. The money. All of it. Was any of it? He stopped, started again. I thought, she said you'd said we could. Nathan. I kept my voice even. No, there was no conversation. There was no permission. There was nothing. He closed his eyes. I didn't know it was that much, he said. It came out small and ashamed. I knew there were some. I told myself it was, I know what you told yourself. I watched his face. It's what people who don't want to ask hard questions do. They tell themselves something and they don't look further. I should have looked further. Yes, you should have. He looked at the table. I don't know how to. Not today. I pushed my chair back and stood. I addressed the table briefly because Carol and Marcus and the cousins deserved at minimum to be acknowledged. I'm sorry this happened here. I want all of you to know that this is not how I wanted any of this to come out. I looked at Carol. I've known you for 30 years. I'm sorry. Carol shook her head. Don't apologize. Not for this. She looked at Nathan and then at the back door, and the look she gave those two things was calibrated and adult and deeply unsentimental. She had seen it too, clearly, in the space of the last 20 minutes. I walked out of the dining room and into the hallway, and I stood there for a moment with my back against the wall. The noise in my head was very loud, and I needed it to quiet before I did the next thing. The next thing was going to be the conversation with Vanessa. She was in the back garden, standing near the rose bed, her arms crossed, her back to the house. She had not heard me come out, or had heard me, and was choosing not to turn around. Either way, I came and stood a few feet behind her, and I looked at the rose bushes that needed cutting back, and I waited. I suppose you think you've won something, she said, without turning. I think I've told the truth in my own house, I said. Whether that's winning is up to you to decide. She turned then. Her face had put itself back together somewhat. The blankness was reassembled, the composure attempted, but underneath it there was something I hadn't seen before. Not remorse. Not exactly. Something raw. The expression of someone who has been running for a long time and has just been made to stop. The situation was, she said, what we needed. You could have asked me. You would have said no. You don't know that. I know you. The contempt in her voice when it came through was real and unguarded, and it told me something, that it had been there for a long time, underneath the performances, the careful management, the practiced warmth. She had never respected me. She had assessed me and found me useful and proceeded accordingly. You would have asked 1,000 questions and made it a whole thing, and I would have said no, I finished, because it was my money that you were not entitled to, and you knew that. She looked at me. So you found another way, I said. A longer way, a more patient way. I watched her face. The power of attorney. That was your plan from the beginning, wasn't it? If you had that, you wouldn't have needed my permission for anything. You could have managed everything yourself. The money, the house, all of it. She didn't answer. The person you've been emailing, I said. The account information I found in that folder. Who is he? Her face shifted, very slightly, but I was watching very closely. I don't know what you think you found. I know what I found, Vanessa. I photographed it. I looked at her steadily. My attorney has the photographs. The silence stretched out between us. Somewhere in the neighborhood, a lawnmower started up. The sound of an ordinary Saturday going on around a moment that was anything but. He was helping me figure out options, she said finally. The voice had gone flat, defensive. Real estate, the property market. Nothing illegal. The property market, I repeated. You were researching selling my house. I was researching options. Options for a property you don't own. I let that sit. Options that would have required either my signature or control over my legal affairs, which is why you needed the power of attorney. I paused. And when that didn't work, you needed to discredit me. To Clara, to Michael, to Marcus. So that if I ever found any of this and said anything, stop. Her voice cracked, just slightly. She caught it. They would already have a reason to question my account of it. She looked away from me, toward the back fence, the overgrown rose bushes. Her jaw was tight. Her hands, I noticed, were not entirely steady. The pregnancy, I said. She didn't move. Were you pregnant, Vanessa? The length of the pause that followed was, in itself, an answer. We were planning to try, she said. That's not what you told me. You said it was happening. You said you needed the bedroom for the baby that was coming. I kept my voice level because I needed it level. There is no baby, is there? She looked back at me. The composure had come undone in small pieces over the last few minutes, and what was underneath it was not the villain of the story I'd been writing in my head. It was a person who had wanted something very badly. Security, status, a future she'd designed, and had built an elaborate architecture to get it, and was now watching the architecture come apart. That didn't make what she'd done less. But it made her human in an uncomfortable way, and I believed in being honest about discomfort. I thought it would buy us time, she said quietly. Time for what? Time to get the finances sorted before... She stopped. Before I found out. She didn't confirm it. She didn't need to. I stood in the garden that needed tending, in the yard of the house that still had my name on the deed, and I looked at the woman who had spent 6 years dismantling my life with patience and precision, and I felt something that surprised me. Not forgiveness. That was not what this was, and I was not going to perform an emotion I hadn't arrived at yet. What I felt was something closer to pity, mixed with a cold and clear-eyed resolve, the way you might feel standing at the edge of something broken, understanding the full extent of the damage. I had done nothing to this woman. I had welcomed her into my family, loaned her my home, trusted her with my son, tried year after year to bridge the distance she kept reestablishing. And none of that generosity had registered in her as something to be honored. It had registered as something to be exploited. She had looked at an open hand and seen a gap to push through. That was not a failure of my generosity. It was a failure of her character, and I was done carrying the weight of other people's failures as if they were my own. I want you to hear something, I said. Both of you. Because I know Nathan can probably hear me from inside. I glanced toward the back door. A movement at the kitchen window, there and then gone. I was right. I want you to understand what is going to happen next. Vanessa looked at me. My attorney will be contacting you formally within the week, I said. The bank records, the power of attorney filing, the photographs, and the email documentation have been provided to a legal specialist in financial elder abuse. The missing items from this house, 14 of them, itemized and photographed, are part of that filing. I paused. This is not a family argument. This is a legal matter, and it will proceed as one. She said nothing. And this house, I said, which has been, is, and will remain in my name, is my home. I will be reclaiming my bedroom today. The lock on that door will be removed today. I held her gaze. If either of you interfere with that, I will call the police and we will let them sort it out. I heard the back door open behind me. Nathan had come out. I didn't turn around. Mom, he said, I know you heard. A long pause. Yes. Do you have anything to say about the bedroom? Another pause. Then very quietly, no. Good. I finally turned to look at him. He was standing on the back step, still in his dinner clothes, his hands in his pockets, looking like a man standing in the wreckage of something he'd told himself was sound. He looked young. He always looked younger when he was ashamed. He'd looked that way at 7, at 14, at 22. He looked that way now at 41. And the continuity of it, the years of it, cracked something in me that I was going to have to deal with later, privately, in a way that had nothing to do with attorneys and documents and legal proceedings. But not now. Now was not the time. I'm going inside, I said. I'm going to ask Marcus to help me move the dressing table, and then I'm going to sleep in my own bedroom tonight. I walked past Nathan, and I went inside, and I didn't look back. Marcus, it turned out, was still at the table with Carol. When I came in and asked him quietly if he'd help me with some furniture, he stood up immediately, without asking why. The way you do for someone when you finally understand what's been happening, and you know the least you can do is not make her ask twice. Carol stood up too. Tell me where, she said. We moved the dressing table together, the three of us. It wasn't graceful, and I scraped my knuckles on the doorframe, and Carol dropped one end briefly, and Marcus said something under his breath that made Carol give him a look. It took 4 trips and 20 minutes, and nobody mentioned Vanessa, who had come back inside and gone upstairs, or Nathan, who was sitting at the kitchen table not doing anything in particular. When it was done, I stood in the doorway of my bedroom. My bedroom. The walls were still mine, even if everything else was wrong. The window, the light coming through it, the view of the side yard where the oak tree I'd planted 15 years ago had grown taller than I remembered. Carol put her hand on my arm briefly. She didn't say anything. Some things don't need words, and she knew that. After they left, I sat on the edge of my bed. My bed, brought back from the hallway closet where it had been folded against the wall, and I let the day come down on me all at once. The lunch, the table, Nathan's face. Vanessa in the garden. The flat, final sound of it all coming apart. I was exhausted. I was 68 years old, and I had been running on anger and purpose for weeks, and the body eventually sends you a bill for that. I lay back on the bed and I looked at the ceiling. The oak tree's shadow moved across the wall the way it always had, in the late afternoon, in certain seasons, a slow, shifting pattern I had watched for years without fully noticing. I noticed it now. I thought, you're still here. I meant the tree, but I also meant myself. I had come home from my sister's burial to find my life on the lawn. I had spent weeks in a storage room gathering the evidence of my own exploitation. I had sat across dinner tables from the people who had done it and kept my face composed and my voice steady while the case against them built itself document by document, photograph by photograph, page by careful page. And today the walls had come down. Not cleanly. Nothing had come down cleanly. Nathan was in the kitchen and Vanessa was upstairs, and the dinner plates were still on the table, and Marcus had forgotten his jacket on the back of a chair, and the rose bushes still needed cutting, and the herb bed was still half dead, and the house was still full of the complicated, unresolved wreckage of everything that had broken. But I was in my bedroom, and tomorrow Daniel was going to file. Daniel filed on a Monday. I knew it was happening because he called me at 8:15 that morning, before I'd finished my first cup of coffee, and said in his measured, unhurried way, "We're filing today. I want you to be prepared for things to move quickly after this. Once the formal complaint is in, Vanessa and Nathan will likely receive notice within the week, and at that point the dynamic in that house is going to change." "How much will it change?" I asked. "Significantly," he said. "Patricia and I both recommend you have somewhere else you can go if the situation becomes untenable. Not because you're required to leave, you are not, but because the period immediately following notification can be unpredictable." I thought about that. I thought about Clara, 4 hours away, who had called me every single day for the past 3 weeks as promised. I thought about Michael, 2 states over, who had started texting me good morning every day after our phone call, Small, steady check-ins that I had come to rely on more than I'd expected. I thought about Dorothy next door, who had brought me a casserole the week before without asking questions, just left it on the porch with a note that said, "You don't have to explain anything. I'm here." "I'll be all right," I said. "I know you will," Daniel said. "I just want you to have a plan." I spent that Monday going about the business of an ordinary day because that was what I had learned to do. I did laundry. I called the garden center about soil amendments for the rose bed. I made a grocery list. I sat at the kitchen table in the afternoon with a cup of tea, and I read 40 pages of a novel I had started 3 times over the past 2 months and never gotten far enough into to care about. Nathan came home at 6. He had been quieter since the Sunday lunch, 4 days ago. Not cold, not hostile, just quieter. A man recalibrating in slow motion, going through the mechanics of daily life while something larger worked itself out beneath the surface. He said hello when he came in. He asked if I needed anything from the kitchen. I said no. He made himself a sandwich and stood at the counter eating it, and we existed in the same room without speaking, which was different from the silence of before. The silence before had been managed, performed, the silence of people pretending everything was fine. This silence was something rawer, something that knew what it was. Vanessa had been spending most of her time upstairs since Sunday. She came down for meals, said little, and went back up. I didn't know what she was thinking, and I had stopped trying to guess. I had spent too much time and too many years trying to understand what Vanessa was thinking, and I had gotten it wrong every single time because I had applied my own framework: good faith, basic decency, the assumption that people mean roughly what they project, to a person who operated on a different framework entirely. I wasn't going to do that anymore. On Wednesday, the notification arrived. I wasn't home when it happened. I had gone to a follow-up appointment with my doctor. A routine thing, blood pressure and cholesterol, nothing to do with any of this. And when I came back, the house had a different feeling. The kind of feeling a room has when something has just happened in it. An alteration in the air. Nathan was in the living room, sitting on the couch with a document in his hands. He looked up when I came in, and something in his face told me immediately. "You already knew," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was more like the last piece of something clicking into place. "Yes," I said. I didn't elaborate. I set my purse on the hall table and I came and sat in the armchair across from him, the blue one that had spent a night on the lawn and was now back where it belonged. He looked down at the document and then up at me. He had aged in the past 4 days in the way people age when they stop pretending. Lines around his eyes, a heaviness around the mouth. $31,000, he said. "Yes." "Mom, He stopped, pressed his lips together. "I knew there were some withdrawals. I told myself I thought maybe you knew and just didn't want to." He stopped again. "That's not true. I told myself that so I didn't have to ask." "I know. I should have asked." "Yes." He looked at the document in his hands. "There's a third party named in this." "I know that too." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the neighbor's dog was barking at something. 3 short bursts and then silence. The refrigerator hummed. The house held its breath. "Who is he?" Nathan said. "I was hoping you could tell me." He shook his head. "I don't know him. The name, I don't recognize it." I believed him. Not because Nathan was incapable of lying to me, he had demonstrated otherwise, but because the specific blankness on his face when he said it was the blankness of genuine unknowing, not concealment. It was the face of a man discovering that the woman he lived with had a layer of operation he had never been shown. "Nathan," I said carefully, "I need to ask you something and I need you to think before you answer." He looked at me. "Has Vanessa mentioned this person to you?" "Not by name necessarily. A contact. Someone she was working with on, she might have called it an investment, a business opportunity, something to do with property." He was quiet for a long moment. I watched him think, actually think, turning it over. "About a year ago," he said slowly, "she mentioned that she'd been talking to someone about the real estate market. Someone she'd met through a professional network thing she went to. She said it was just, she was interested in understanding the market, maybe investing eventually." He paused. "I didn't ask much about it. I didn't," he exhaled. I didn't ask about a lot of things. Did she ever mention this house specifically, in that context? The pause that followed was longer than I expected. His face did something that told me the answer before his mouth did. Once, he said, she said that a property like this, in this neighborhood, would have significant value if it were ever... She said if we ever decided to downsize, we'd be in a good position. He looked at me. I thought she meant us, all of us. Eventually. I took it at face value. Downsize. The word sat between us with everything it contained. Vanessa, discussing the sale value of a property she did not own, with a third party, framing it to Nathan as a distant, mutual, eventual plan. She had been moving toward this for longer than I'd understood. Where is she now? I asked. Upstairs. His voice was flat. She came down when the notification arrived. There was a conversation. She went back up. What kind of conversation? He looked out the window. She told me I needed to stand by her, that this was something we were facing together, and that family loyalty meant... He stopped. I told her I wanted to talk to you first. Something in my chest shifted very slightly. Not relief exactly. Something smaller than that. An acknowledgement. And, I said. She didn't like that. He set the document on the coffee table. His hands were steady, but only just. Mom, I need to understand what's going to happen. To us, to the house, to... The house is mine, Nathan. That isn't going to change. I kept my voice level. What happens after that depends on a number of things. Daniel will walk you through the legal dimensions. You should get your own attorney. My own? He blinked. Separate from you. Yes, separate from me. I looked at him carefully. Nathan, you had authorized access to that account. Depending on how this proceeds, your own exposure needs to be understood separately from mine. I'm not saying that to frighten you. I'm saying it because it's the truth and you need to know it. He went pale. Not dramatically. A slow draining that started at his forehead and moved down. Am I in legal trouble? I don't know yet. That depends on what you knew and when and what you can demonstrate. But you need your own counsel, someone who's representing your interests. I paused. Not hers. Yours. He sat very still. I watched him absorb that distinction. Your interests, not hers. And I watched it separate things in him that had been intertwined for 6 years. The disentanglement slow and clearly painful. The way it always is when you finally acknowledge that two things that felt like one were actually pulling in different directions all along. He put his face in his hands for a moment. Just a moment. Then he lifted his head and said, "What do I do first?" And despite everything, the money, the lawn, the storage room, the months of pretending, the long and patient collaboration in his own silence, I felt something pull toward him that I did not try to push away. He was still my son. That did not erase what he'd allowed, but it was still true. Call an attorney, I said. In the morning. Tonight, stay calm and don't say anything to Vanessa about this conversation. I paused. And eat something. You look like you haven't eaten today. He almost laughed. It came out wrong, too thin, but it was something. Yeah, he said. Okay. The week that followed was the most exhausting of my life, and I had lived through some exhausting weeks. The filing generated paperwork, follow-up calls, requests from Patricia for additional documentation, a formal interview that I sat through for 2.5 hours in Daniel's office, answering questions in specific, careful language about things I had lived through and was now required to describe in the flat register of legal record. Patricia was good. She was also relentless, which was what I needed, even when relentless meant sitting across a table and being asked to recount the day my furniture was on the lawn with the same emotional detachment you'd use to describe a weather event. At home, the atmosphere had become something I can only describe as glacial. Not violent, not explosive, just very cold and very still, the way air gets before something breaks. Vanessa had stopped coming down for dinner. She ate in the bedroom, or didn't eat, I couldn't tell. She and Nathan were not speaking in any way I could hear, and Nathan was sleeping in the guest room, which was a fact I knew, without either of them telling me, because I heard the different door close at night. Clara arrived on a Thursday. She drove the 4 hours without telling me she was coming, just texted me when she was 40 minutes out. On my way. Don't argue. I didn't argue. I met her at the front door and she hugged me for a long time without saying anything, which was unlike Clara, who normally filled silence with words, and the fact that she didn't made it mean more. She pulled back and looked at my face with the assessing eyes I had always found slightly unnerving in her, even when I was proud of them. "You look tired," she said. "I am tired." "You also look like yourself." She picked up her bag, which is more than I expected, honestly. She stayed for 5 days. She slept in the room that had been the storage room. By then I had cleared it out and put a proper bed in, transforming it back into the guest room it had been before all of this. And she was present in the house in the way Clara was always present, filling rooms, asking questions, not particularly interested in anyone's discomfort. She met Vanessa twice in the hallway. Both times she said hello in a voice that was entirely civil and entirely without warmth, which was, in its own way, more devastating than hostility would have been. Vanessa said hello back and kept moving, and Clara watched her go with an expression I had never quite seen on my daughter's face before. "She's scared," Clara said to me that evening, quietly, in the kitchen. "Yes," I said. "Good." Clara picked up her tea. "She should be." That wasn't the whole truth, and we both knew it, but sometimes you let a person say the simple version of a thing because they need it, and the nuance can wait. On the 4th day of Clara's visit, Michael arrived. He drove through the night from 2 states away and appeared at the front door at 6:30 in the morning with a duffel bag and dark circles under his eyes, and the expression of a man who had decided something on a long drive and wasn't going to be talked out of it. He was 39, and he looked like Raymond in the early morning light, the same jaw, the same way of standing with his weight slightly forward, and it hit me somewhere I wasn't prepared for. He hugged me and said, into the top of my head, "I should have come sooner." "You're here now," I said. "I know, but I should have—" "Michael." I pulled back and looked at him. "You're here. That's what matters to me right now." He stayed a week. He and Clara overlapped for 2 days, which was its own particular experience. My 2 most strong-willed children in the same house, both of them running on protectiveness and delayed guilt, both of them entirely certain they knew the best way to handle every situation. They disagreed about 3 separate things in the first 12 hours, and argued about all 3 in the kitchen while I sat at the table drinking coffee and listening to them and feeling, for the first time in months, something I could only describe as warmth. They were here. They were fighting about nothing important. They were taking up space in my kitchen the way my children were supposed to take up space in my kitchen. Whatever else was happening, that was real, and it was mine, and nobody had taken it. The night before Clara left, we sat on the back porch after dinner. The garden was in shadow, the oak tree's shape dark against the evening sky. We had a bottle of wine that Clara had brought, and we were working through it slowly, not saying much. "What happens to Nathan?" Clara said finally. I had been waiting for the question. "That depends on him." "Are you going to go after him legally?" Daniel and Patricia are looking at his exposures separately from Vanessa's. The account access complicates things. I turned my glass in my hands. He didn't initiate the withdrawals. The evidence suggests she did. But he knew, or should have known, and he said nothing. I paused. Whether that rises to legal liability or stays in the category of moral failure is something I honestly don't know yet. Clara was quiet for a moment. "How do you feel about him?" I thought about how to answer that with any accuracy. "I feel about him the way you feel about someone you've loved your whole life who has deeply disappointed you," I said. "Those 2 things don't cancel each other out. They just both exist at the same time, and it's uncomfortable." Clara nodded slowly. She understood complicated feelings about Nathan. They'd had their own version of things over the years. "What about Vanessa?" she said. "That's simpler," I said. "Not easier, but simpler." Clara didn't push further. She poured the last of the wine between us, and we sat in the evening quiet and let the garden be what it was, neglected, overgrown, needing work but still alive. Vanessa left on a Saturday. I did not see her go. I was in the garden when it happened. I had started cutting back the rose bushes that morning. Finally, 4 weeks of waiting transformed into the physical work of pruning, and I heard the door and the sound of something heavy being loaded, and I kept cutting. I did not go inside. I did not watch. Nathan came out to the garden about an hour after the sound stopped. He stood at the edge of the rose bed for a moment. I kept working. "She's gone," he said. "I know." He was quiet. "She took her things." Her clothes, her personal stuff. She left everything else. A pause. She didn't say goodbye to me. I set down the pruning shears and looked at him. He was standing in the weak autumn sunlight with his hands in his pockets, and he looked the way you look when something you've held on to for a long time finally lets go of you. Not relieved exactly, not free exactly, something more complicated and more truthful than either of those words. "Nathan," I said. He looked at me. "Come help me with these roses." He blinked. "What?" "They need cutting back. The canes are overgrown." I held out the second pair of pruning shears I'd brought out. "Come help me." He took the shears. He came and stood beside me at the rose bed. He was terrible at it. He kept cutting in the wrong place, and I had to redirect him twice. But he stayed and he worked, and after a while the silence between us was just two people in a garden, which was a different kind of silence from everything that had come before. We worked for an hour. We didn't talk about Vanessa. We didn't talk about the legal case or the money or the Sunday lunch or the storage room. We talked about where to cut above the butt eye and whether the soil needed amending and whether the canes on the far end could be saved or needed to come out entirely. At some point, Nathan said, without looking up from the bush he was working on, "I'm going to get my own place. I've been looking." "Okay," I said. "I think I need to. I can't stay here right now. It's too—" He stopped. "I think I need some space to figure some things out." "That's probably right." "I'm not running away," he said. There was something urgent in it, a need to be understood that I recognized from when he was a teenager. From every time in his life he'd needed me to see the distinction between the thing he was doing and the worst version of it. "I'm not just Nathan." I looked at him. "I know." He exhaled. His shoulders dropped slightly. "I'm going to spend a long time being sorry," he said. "I know that too." Is there, he struggled with it. Is there a way back from this? For us? It was the hardest question he'd asked me through all of it. Harder than any of the practical questions, harder than the money and the paperwork and the attorney. Because it had no clean answer and no timeline and no documentation to point to. "I don't know yet," I said honestly. "I think that depends on what you do next, not what you say, what you do." He nodded slowly. He understood. He was 41 years old, and he had made serious mistakes, and the path back from them, if there was one, was going to be made of actions over a long time, not words over a short one. I think some part of him had always known that. I think the problem was that knowing something and doing it are two different things, and he had chosen the space between them for too long. He left 3 weeks later. He found an apartment across town, helped me move some furniture back where it belonged before he went, and hugged me at the door in a way that was genuine and uncomfortable in equal measure. The embrace of someone who is not sure if they're forgiven and knows they don't have the right to ask yet. I didn't tell him it was fine. I told him to take care of himself. I told him to keep his attorney's number close. I told him to call me when he was settled. He called me 10 days later. It was settled. We talked for 20 minutes. It was not an easy conversation. It was a real one. The investigation into the third party, the man whose name appeared in Vanessa's email exchanges, whose account information I'd photographed in the bedroom folder, moved faster than Daniel had predicted. His name was Gary Seibert. He ran what Patricia described, in the precise language of legal documentation, as a predatory property acquisition scheme targeting homeowners in financial or familial distress. He had a record. Not a long one, not yet, but enough to establish a pattern that aligned with what he and Vanessa had been discussing in those emails. When Patricia told me this, we were sitting in her office on a gray November morning, the windows streaked with rain, and she said it in her matter-of-fact way that didn't dramatize things because she dealt with them too regularly for drama. "He identified your property through county deed records," she said. "Properties owned solely by older adults are a targeting category. He looked for situations where there might be family conflict around the property. It makes the target more vulnerable and more likely to accept an arrangement." She paused. "Vanessa made contact with him, not the other way around. Based on the email timeline, she reached out." I sat with that. "She found him." "Yes." "She went looking for someone to help her take my house." "That's what the evidence indicates." I looked out the rain-streaked window for a moment. I thought about the timeline, Vanessa reaching out to someone like Gary Seibert suggested a level of intentionality I had grasped intellectually, but now had to hold as confirmed fact. She hadn't drifted into this. She hadn't been opportunistic in a weak moment. She had, at some point in the years she'd lived under my roof, decided that she was going to take what she wanted from my life, and had actively sought out the tools to do it. "What happens to him?" I said. "That's moving through a separate channel now. He's been flagged by the county fraud office. There are other cases." Patricia looked at me directly. "Your documentation was part of what triggered the broader look. You should know that." I absorbed that. "And Vanessa?" "She's retained an attorney. The negotiation process will begin soon. Given the weight of the evidence, we're in a strong position." A pause. "She may try to make a case that Nathan directed the withdrawals or that you had given informal permission. We're prepared for both." "She'll use Nathan," I said. "She may try." Patricia's expression didn't change. "Our documentation makes that difficult, but yes, it's a possibility." I thought about Nathan in his new apartment across town, figuring out what he was made of after 41 years of not fully knowing. I thought about how Vanessa would use him even now, from a distance, as a legal instrument if it served her, without hesitation. I thought about what it meant to love someone that efficiently, that instrumentally, as a resource and not as a person. I thought about what it must have been like to live inside a love like that, and not see it for what it was, and lose it all at once on a gray November morning. I didn't feel sorry for Vanessa. I want to be clear about that. What she had done was not the product of desperation or damage or a single bad choice. It was the product of a sustained and deliberate decision to treat other people as materials. That is a choice, and it has consequences, and I was one of them. But I felt something for Nathan, standing at the edge of understanding all of this. Something difficult that I did not have a clean word for and was going to have to sit with for a long time. 2 weeks after that meeting with Patricia, the health crisis hit. I had been feeling off for several days, a heaviness in my chest that I attributed to stress, a shortness of breath that I told myself was from working too hard in the garden, a fatigue that went deeper than tired. I ignored it the way people ignore things when they have too many other things to deal with, which is to say, I ignored it badly, in the way where you notice the thing every day and tell yourself you'll deal with it tomorrow. On a Tuesday night, I woke at 2 in the morning with the heaviness worse than it had ever been, a pressure that sat across my chest and would not lift, and I lay in the dark for exactly 4 minutes. I know because I counted them. Before I reached for my phone and called Clara. "Something's wrong," I said when she answered. With my chest, "I need you to stay on the phone while I call an ambulance." She did not argue. She did not ask me if I was sure. She said, "I'm getting in the car right now. Call 911 and then call me back." I called 911. I called Clara back. The ambulance arrived in 11 minutes. It was not a heart attack, as it turned out, though it looked enough like one that they treated it as one until the tests came back. What it was, the cardiologist told me the next morning, in the careful language of someone delivering news to a person who has earned the straight version, was a hypertensive crisis. My blood pressure had reached levels that constituted a medical emergency, driven by sustained chronic stress over a period of months. "Your body kept the score," he said, which I thought was a remarkably precise way to put it. Clara was there when he said it. She was sitting in the chair beside the hospital bed, wearing yesterday's clothes because she'd driven through the night, and she looked exhausted and furious and terrified in the way only Clara could hold all three at once. "She's been under extraordinary stress," Clara said to the cardiologist, which was technically true but drastically understated. He looked at my chart. "I can see that. We're going to stabilize the blood pressure, but I want to be clear. The management of what caused this is as important as the medication." He looked at me. "Whatever is generating this level of sustained stress needs to change." "It's changing," I said. Michael arrived that afternoon. He walked into the hospital room and stopped when he saw me in the bed, and his face did something I was not prepared for. Not the careful adult composure he usually maintained, but something younger, more open, closer to the boy he'd been, and he crossed the room and held my hand without saying anything for a long minute. "I'm all right," I told him. "I know," he said. He didn't let go of my hand. Clara said from the chair, "You are absolutely not going back to that house alone." "It's my house," I said. "I know it's your house. I'm not saying it's not your house. I'm saying you're not going back to it alone until you're stable." She looked at Michael, and he looked at her, and something passed between them that I recognized as the specific communication of adult siblings who have argued about something and reached a decision before the relevant parent was in the room. We worked it out on the way up. Michael is going to stay with you for the next 3 weeks. I'm going to come back in 2 weeks and we'll reassess. I looked at Michael. You don't have to. Mom. He squeezed my hand. Let us do this. I want to tell you that I accepted it easily, that I recognized the grace in being helped and opened my hands and received it. The truth is, it took me 2 full days to stop trying to manage the situation from the hospital bed and let my children take care of me. I am not good at being taken care of. I am not sure I ever learned how. 40 years of being the person who handled things makes it very hard to be the person things are being handled for. But I let them. I let them sit with me and bring me bad hospital coffee and argue with the nurses about visiting hours and drive me home when I was discharged and stock my refrigerator and argue about who was sleeping where. The house felt different when I came back to it, quieter than it had been for months. Not the cold quiet of surveillance and performance, but the genuine quiet of a place that had been through something and was resting. The dressing table was gone. Vanessa's shoes were gone. My bedroom was mine again, fully, without the residue of her occupation pressing in at the edges. Michael made dinner the first night. It was not a particularly skilled cook. He had his father's fundamental competence and his father's utter lack of creativity in the kitchen, which meant everything was seasoned identically. But it was hot, and there was enough of it, and he put it on the table and sat across from me, and we ate together in the kitchen with the yellow curtains. And I thought about all the dinners I had made in this kitchen over 20-some years, the ordinary ones and the holiday ones, and the ones nobody remembered, and the ones everyone did. We talked. Not about the case, not about Vanessa or Nathan or any of it. We talked about Michael's job, which he loved but found exhausting. We talked about a trip he'd been thinking about. We talked about his father, which we did sometimes and not often enough, the comfortable and slightly sad conversation of people who miss the same person. He said, Dad would have lost his mind over all of this. Yes, I said. He would have. He would have driven straight up here the day you called him. He would have been here before I finished the sentence. I set down my fork. But he also would have wanted me to handle it myself. He always said I was the one who knew how to wait. Michael smiled at that. Is that what you were doing? Waiting? Gathering, I said, which is different. The legal process moved in the way legal processes move. Not quickly, not cleanly, with reversals and paperwork and days when nothing seemed to be happening, and then sudden movements that required immediate attention. Vanessa's attorney made the anticipated argument that Nathan had directed the withdrawals. Patricia dismantled it efficiently with documentation of the specific timing and pattern of charges, most of which occurred when Nathan was demonstrably at work. The argument didn't hold. It was tried and it failed, which is the way things usually work when the other side has 19 months of transaction records and email exchanges and a failed power of attorney filing in the county record. There was a negotiation. There was a settlement. I am not going to give you every number and term because some of it was confidential and some of it was simply too exhausting to revisit in detail. What I will tell you is that the settlement addressed the financial damages in a way Daniel and Patricia considered fair, and that it included a formal acknowledgement, which was the thing I had wanted most, more than the money itself, that the funds had been taken without authorization. It said so in writing. That mattered to me more than I can fully explain. Not for legal reasons. For the more personal reason that when you have been gaslit, told that things didn't happen the way you remember them, told that your account of your own experience is the product of a confused and aging mind, having the truth written down in a formal document signed by the person who confused things has a weight that nothing else quite replaces. The truth existed. It was documented. No one could paper over it now. Gary Seibert's situation was resolved separately, through the county fraud office and a civil case that Patricia had connected my documentation to. That process took longer, and I was not central to it, but Patricia kept me informed, and what I understood was that my folder of photographs had been one of several documented cases against him, and that the collective weight of them had made things considerably less comfortable for Mr. Seibert than his business model had apparently anticipated. He had picked a target he expected to be easy. He had miscalculated the target. Nathan called me the evening after the settlement was finalized. He had been kept informed through his own attorney, so he knew what the outcome was. "Mom," he said, "I wanted to say, I know this doesn't cover it. I know there's not a thing I can say that covers what happened, but I wanted you to hear it from me directly." A pause. "I'm sorry for the money, for the room, for the lawn, for not asking questions I should have asked a long time ago." Another pause. "For not seeing what was happening to you while I was living in the same house." I sat with the apology for a moment. Let it be what it was. Real, inadequate, the beginning of something rather than the resolution of it. "I hear you," I said. "Is that enough for now?" "It's a start," I said. "Keep going." He exhaled, and I heard in that exhale something unclenching that had been wound tight for a very long time. "I'll keep going," he said. "I promise." I did not tell him promises were enough. Promises were not what we were working in now. We were working in time, and in the slow accumulation of days in which he would either show up or not show up, and we would both find out which man he actually was when the comfort of self-deception had been taken away. That was the real test. Not the apology, not the intention. The test was the long, unspectacular work of becoming someone who deserved to be trusted again. He had a long way to go, but he had called. That night I sat on the back porch for a while before I went to bed. Michael was inside, watching something on the television. The night was clear and cold, the kind of clear that comes after a long stretch of gray, where the sky goes very dark and very deep, and there are more stars than you usually see. I was tired in my bones in a way that went beyond the physical, the kind of tired that accumulates when you have been carrying something heavy for a long time and have only just set it down. The body doesn't catch up immediately, keeps bracing for the weight even after it's gone. My chest was better, not perfect. The cardiologist had been clear that my blood pressure would need monitoring and management for the rest of my life, which was one more thing this period had cost me, but better. The medication was working. The sleep had improved. Michael's bad cooking was inexplicably doing something for me. The garden was still a project. Half the rose bed had been cut back, but the other half needed work. The herb bed was probably a write-off until spring. The soil in the beds along the fence needed amending, and the oak tree had a branch coming down lower than it should. There was work to do, a lot of it. I looked at the garden in the dark, and I thought about all the things that had been broken and all the things that were slowly, imperfectly being repaired, and the distance between those two categories, which was still significant but was no longer the entire landscape. I had been thrown away from my own home. I had come back. I had done it in the hardest way, the long way, the way that required me to be more precise and more patient and more clear-eyed than I had ever had to be in my life. And I was still here. The stars were out. The oak tree moved slightly in the night wind. Into it I could hear the faint sound of the television and Michael's occasional commentary to himself, which he always did when he was watching alone, a habit he'd had since childhood, talking back to screens. I sat with all of it for a while. Then I went inside because it was cold, and I had a doctor's appointment in the morning, and there was work to do. Winter settled over the house the way winters do in this part of the country. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in increments. First the light changed, going thin and pale by early afternoon. Then the garden went completely dormant, everything pulled back into the ground, the rose canes bare, the herb bed reduced to dry stalks, the oak tree standing in its skeleton against a sky that stayed gray for days at a time. Then the cold came in properly, the kind that gets into old houses through the window frames and the gaps under doors, and you feel it as a specific weight in the mornings when you first get out of bed. I felt it more than I used to. That was one of the things the cardiologist had been honest with me about. The hypertensive crisis had left a residue, not in my heart, which was structurally sound, but in the system overall, in the way my body managed cold and fatigue and stress. It would take time, possibly a long time. He had said, "You're 68, not 88. You have reserves you haven't accessed yet, but you have to stop spending them on things that don't deserve them." I thought about that a lot over those winter months. The idea of what deserves your reserves, what deserves the deep energy, the best attention, the careful parts of yourself that you've been accumulating over a lifetime. I had spent too much of that currency in the wrong places, not just recently, for years, decades maybe, of quietly absorbing other people's difficulties and redirecting my own resources towards smoothing things over, keeping the peace, being the person who handled what needed handling without making anyone uncomfortable by admitting the cost. The cost had eventually been paid, not by me choosing to pay it, by my body simply submitting the bill. Michael stayed his 3 weeks as promised, and then another 10 days after that because he found a way to work remotely, and he said he wasn't ready to leave yet, which I suspected was partly true, and partly that he needed something from being in this house right now, some repair of his own that required proximity. I didn't ask about it. I made room for it. That's what you do when the people you love are quietly healing. You make room, and you don't ask them to explain it. Clara came back exactly when she said she would, on a Saturday morning with a carload of things she said she'd been meaning to bring me for months. A proper electric blanket, a new set of pots because she felt my existing ones were insufficient, 3 novels she had marked up with her own underlining, which was her version of a gift, and a small herb garden kit that she set on the kitchen windowsill and explained carefully as though I hadn't been growing herbs outdoors for 20 years. Indoor herbs, Mom, so you have something green in here through winter. I know what indoor herbs are, Clara. Well, you seemed surprised when I mentioned it on the phone. I was surprised that you were bringing them. I wasn't surprised they existed. She gave me the look she had given me since she was 17, the look that said she knew I was being contrary and she was choosing to let it go. I had missed that look. I hadn't realized how much until it was in my kitchen again. She and Michael overlapped for 2 days, same as before, and they argued again. This time about whether my kitchen needed reorganizing, which Clara thought it did, and Michael thought was unnecessary, and I thought was a perfect argument for me to stay completely out of. And then Michael left on a Sunday afternoon, and I stood at the front door and watched his car until it turned the corner, and Clara came and stood beside me, and neither of us said anything for a moment. "He's going to be okay," she said. "I know." I closed the door. "So are you." She looked at me. "I wasn't worried about me." "I know that too," I said. "I'm saying it anyway." She stayed 4 days. When she left, she hugged me at the door the way she had when she arrived, long, without words. And then she pulled back and held my face in both her hands the way I used to hold hers when she was small, and she looked at me steadily. "You call me," she said. "I will. Not just when something's wrong, just to talk." "I will, Clara." She let go and picked up her bag. At the car, she turned back once. "The herbs need water every 3 days, not more. I know how to water plants." 3 days, Mom." She got in the car. I watched her go. The house was quiet in a way I had not experienced in a very long time. Not the cold, managed quiet of the months when Nathan and Vanessa were here and everything was performance and surveillance. Not the sharp, adrenaline-soaked quiet of the weeks when I was gathering evidence and keeping my face composed over dinner. This was a genuine quiet. The quiet of a house that had been through something tremendous and was now, tentatively, at rest. I walked through every room that first morning alone, not because anything needed checking, just because I wanted to feel the space as mine again, to move through it without calculating how I looked or what I might inadvertently reveal. I stood in the kitchen with the yellow curtains. I stood in the living room where the blue armchair was back in its place. I stood in the hallway where the photographs were back on the walls. Not all of them. Some were still in the box from the lawn, and some I'd had to have reframed because the frames had cracked when they were thrown out, and a few were simply gone and would not come back. But enough of them. The hallway felt like my hallway again. I stood in my bedroom doorway. My bedroom. The dressing table was gone. My bookshelves were back, partially restocked. Some books had disappeared along with everything else. Another item on the list of things I was slowly accepting as permanent losses. The jewelry box had not been found. Patricia's office had traced several items to an online resale platform, and the legal process around recovering or being compensated for them was ongoing, but the jewelry box specifically had not surfaced. Maybe it had been sold, privately, to someone who would never know what it was. Maybe it was in a storage unit somewhere. Maybe Vanessa had simply thrown it away. I thought about Raymond's card. For my Evelyn. Always. I had memorized those 5 words a long time ago, which was the thing about losing something that contains a piece of someone you loved. You can lose the object, but if you did the work of really holding it, really looking at it, the thing it carried is still in you. I did the work. I had looked at that card hundreds of times over 22 years. I knew every curve of his handwriting. I knew the slight pressure he used on the capital E, the way the Y in my looped lower than it needed to. I had it. Not the paper, but the part that mattered. I stood in the bedroom doorway, and I took a breath that went all the way down. Then I went to make breakfast. The legal case against Gary Seibert concluded in February, 3 months after the initial filing. Patricia sent me the outcome in an email that I read at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning with my second cup of coffee. He had been found liable in the civil case. There were financial penalties. There were other plaintiffs. 4 other cases that had been consolidated with mine. 4 other households he had targeted with the same patient, predatory methodology. The county had opened a separate criminal inquiry. I read the email twice. I sat with the information. I did not feel triumphant. I had expected to feel something larger when it ended, some resolution that had a cleanness to it. What I felt instead was a quieter thing, a settling, like the last piece of a very heavy structure being placed, and the whole thing finally going still. He had chosen me because he thought I was easy. He had looked at a 68-year-old woman living alone with a family in transition, and he had calculated that I would not fight back, would not know how, would not have the resources or the will or the clear-headedness to see what was being done to me and respond to it with anything more than confusion. I was not entirely wrong about the confusion. In those early days, when I sat in the storage room with my bank statements and my green notebook, I had been confused. I had been shocked and grieving and exhausted. Confusion was a reasonable response to what had happened. The difference between me and what he had counted on was that confusion was not my final state. I had moved through it. And I had moved through it because I had spent 68 years learning to move through hard things, and no amount of calculation can fully prepare a predator for a woman who has already survived what life put in front of her. I forwarded Patricia's email to Clara and Michael with no added message. Clara called within 20 minutes. Michael texted, "Good. That's done," which was, for Michael, an essay. I called Daniel. "It's over," I said when he answered. "The Seibert matter, yes." He paused. "How do you feel?" "Tired," I said, "and clear, like something that was fogging everything has lifted." "That's about right," he said. "Evelyn, I want to tell you something. In 30-plus years of doing this, I have not often worked with someone who came to me in the middle of what you were in the middle of and was as organized as you were. The notebook, the photographs, the way you documented things while you were still living inside the situation." A pause. "Most people can't do that. Most people are too overwhelmed. You should know it made the difference." I held the phone for a moment. "I had a lot of practice being the person who holds things together," I said finally. "Well," he said, "this time you held the right things." We tied up the remaining paperwork over the next several weeks, and when it was finally completely done, every document signed, every matter closed, I sat in Daniel's office for the last formal meeting, and I shook his hand and Patricia's hand, and I walked out into the pale February sunlight feeling lighter than I had in more than a year. Not healed. I want to be clear about that, because I think stories like this one tend toward a particular ending, the triumphant resolution, the clean emotional landing, the protagonist emerging from the fire entirely restored. That is not what happened. What happened was messier and more gradual and more honest than that. I was not the same woman who had driven home from my sister's funeral and found her life on the lawn. Some of what had changed was loss. The jewelry box, the mirror, some irreplaceable photographs, $31,000, that the settlement addressed only partially because no settlement fully addresses that kind of violation, and the particular innocence of believing that the people living under your roof are living there in good faith. Some of what had changed was something harder to name, a recalibration, a seeing clearly that, once arrived at, cannot be undone. I knew things about myself that I hadn't known a year ago, about the places where I had been too soft, too accommodating, too willing to let discomfort settle rather than name it, about the cost of prioritizing other people's ease over my own dignity, about how a person can be slowly diminished, degree by degree, without any single moment that feels like the moment it happened, because the architecture of diminishment is designed precisely to prevent you from seeing it clearly until it is very advanced. I knew those things now. That knowledge was not comfortable, but it was mine. Spring came gradually, the way it does. Not as a single event, but as a series of small insistences. A forsythia blooming ahead of schedule at the corner of the yard. Crocuses coming up in the front bed before the last frost had properly finished. The light shifting by 10 minutes a day, arriving earlier, staying later, until one morning I woke and the room was already bright, and I lay in bed for a moment just receiving it. I started working in the garden in earnest in March. The rose bed needed the most attention. I had cut the canes back in the fall, but the soil was depleted and compacted, and the root systems of two of the older plants had been damaged by neglect. I spent 3 weekends amending the soil, working in compost, coaxing the damaged plants with the slow, specific attention of someone who knows that you cannot rush a living thing that has been stressed. You can only give it what it needs and wait. The herb bed came back on its own, mostly. Mint always comes back. Time is stubborn in the best way. The basil I had to replant, but the perennials had wintered over in the root and emerged in April looking tentative but alive. Dorothy came over on a Saturday in April to help me stake the tomato plants, which was a task she had helped me with every spring for 11 years. And we worked side by side in the way of women who have been neighbors long enough that the silence between them is comfortable, and the conversation picks up and drops off naturally without either of them having to manage it. At one point she said, without looking up from the stake she was driving, "I never liked her, you know." I looked over. "Vanessa?" From the start. Something about the way she looked at things in this house. Dorothy considered. Like she was taking inventory. I thought about that. "Why didn't you say anything? Would you have listened?" I opened my mouth, closed it. "Probably not," I admitted. "No." She gave the stake a final push. "People need to arrive at things in their own time. I just made sure I had a casserole ready when you got there." I laughed. It came out rough and real, and startled me slightly, because I had not laughed easily in a long time, and my body had apparently forgotten the musculature of it. Dorothy looked at me with the straightforward satisfaction of someone whose casserole had done its job. Nathan came to the house for the first time since he'd moved out on the first Saturday in May. He had called ahead, which I appreciated, not because I would have turned him away if he'd just shown up, but because the calling ahead was itself a thing. It said, "I know this is your space and I'm asking to come into it," not assuming. He had not always understood that distinction. Apparently he was learning it. He arrived at 10 in the morning in the clothes he wore on weekends, jeans, a flannel shirt, the kind of worn, comfortable look he'd had since college, and he stood at the front door with a flat of strawberry plants under one arm. "I remembered you wanted to try strawberries this year," he said. "You mentioned it last spring, and He paused. "I never helped you get them, so." I looked at the strawberry plants. They were good ones, properly started, healthy root systems visible at the drainage holes. "Come in," I said. We spent the morning in the garden. He did not apologize repeatedly, which was one of the things I had asked of him in a conversation 2 months earlier. I had told him that what I needed from him was not a sustained campaign of verbal contrition, because words had been too cheap in this family for too long, and I was done accepting them as currency. What I needed was the other thing, the showing up. The strawberry plants, the Saturday morning. He was still not good at gardening. He planted 2 of the strawberry starts too shallow, and I had to redirect him, which he accepted without defensiveness, crouching back down to fix them without making it into a moment. We had lunch on the back porch. I had made sandwiches, nothing elaborate, just what was in the refrigerator. And we ate them and drank iced tea, and the garden was around us in its April turning May state. The roses showing their first real growth since the fall, the herbs filling in, the strawberry starts in their new bed looking small and provisional. He said, at some point, "How are you actually doing? Not the version you tell people." I looked at him. He was watching me with the particular attention he'd had as a child, when he was trying to understand something that mattered to him. "Most days I'm all right," I said honestly. "Some days I'm angry, not always at you. Sometimes just at the whole thing. At myself for not seeing it sooner." I paused. "Some days I miss your father so much it sits on my chest like something physical. Because he would have known what to do with all of this, and he would have been very clear-eyed about it in a way that I had to learn to be on my own." Nathan was quiet for a moment. He would have been so angry. He would have been, I agreed. But he also would have been proud of how you're handling it now. Nathan looked at the garden. His jaw moved slightly. That's Thank you for saying that. I said it because it's true, not to make you feel better. I picked up my tea. He was very good at telling people hard truths and then telling them the thing that came after the hard truth. I could never do that as well as he did. I'm still learning. We sat in the garden for another hour after lunch, and then Nathan helped me move some bags of soil amendment to the back of the shed, and then he stood at the back door and said he'd go so I could rest. And I told him he didn't have to rush, and he said he wasn't rushing. He just knew I had things to do, and I thought, this is how it goes, slowly, without ceremony, one Saturday at a time. Come back next month, I said. He looked at me carefully. Yeah? The strawberries will need checking, and the roses are going to need deadheading by then. I looked at him. You can learn to do that right this time. Something moved across his face that I didn't try to name. He nodded. Next month, he said. He came next month, and the month after that. He came through the summer, every 3 to 4 weeks, sometimes for an afternoon and sometimes for most of a day. And we worked in the garden or sat on the porch or made dinner together in the kitchen, and we talked, not always about the hard things, sometimes just about whatever was in front of us. His apartment, which he was slowly making into a home, a book he was reading, a problem at work, small, ordinary things. The hard things came up sometimes too. Not every visit. But when they did, we dealt with them in the register of two people who had decided to be honest with each other after a long period of not being, which means it was uncomfortable sometimes and incomplete always, the way real conversations are. He told me things about the years of his marriage that I had not known, about the pressure Vanessa had put on him, the ways she had managed him, the slow erosion of his own judgment that he had mistaken for harmony. I listened without exonerating him, because he had made choices even inside that pressure, and he knew that and I knew that, and neither of us was going to pretend otherwise. But I listened. That was the thing. I actually listened, which was different from the listening I had done for years. The listening that was really waiting to reassure, really searching for reasons not to worry. I listened to hear what was true, and what I found when I did that was something I had not fully let myself see before. My son was a person, with damage I had not caused and could not fix, doing the imperfect, ongoing work of trying to be better. That did not absolve him, but it was real, and I was done looking away from things that were real. Clara came in June for a long weekend. She and Nathan were in the same house for the first time since the previous fall's lunch, and it was about as smooth as you would expect from two people who had never fully understood each other and were now attempting a new configuration of their relationship. There was a dinner the first night that had several tense silences and one sharp exchange about something that started as a disagreement about whether the garden needed a drip irrigation system and was clearly about something else entirely. I let them manage it. They were adults. They had to find their own way through. By the second day, they had reached a provisional peace, the kind that doesn't resolve the underlying differences, but decides to set them aside for the duration. Clara helped Nathan identify why 2 of the rose starts weren't taking, which required her to defer to his recent knowledge, and he accepted her assessment about the irrigation question. And by the afternoon, they were working in the garden together without incident, which I considered a significant achievement. Michael came in July, a longer visit this time, 8 days. He brought his girlfriend, a woman named Renata, who was compact and dry-humored and entirely unbothered by the general Harper family chaos, which I liked in a person. She helped me replant the herb bed with varieties I hadn't tried before, and she told me in an offhand way that suggested she said things offhand when she meant them most, that Michael had talked about this house his whole life. He used to say his mom's garden was the most peaceful place he knew, she said, pressing soil around a lemon-thyme start. I looked at the garden around us. The roses were in their summer bloom. The strawberries had given us more than I expected, enough for a pie, enough to freeze for winter, enough to bring Dorothy a basket and still have some left. The oak tree was fully leafed, its shadow moving across the grass in the afternoon light. It didn't feel very peaceful for a while, I said. Renata looked up. No, but it does now. I thought about that for a moment. She was right. It did. August brought the heat that always comes in August, the heavy settled heat that makes the garden lush and slightly wild-looking, everything growing faster than you can tend it. I was in the garden every morning before the worst of it, and in the evenings again when it eased, and I found in those hours the particular quality of mind that physical work in a familiar place produces. Not emptiness exactly, but a clearing, a kind of active stillness where things settle into proportion. I thought about Margaret a lot in the garden. She had not been a gardener. She was impatient with things that grew on their own timeline. She liked projects she could complete in an afternoon. But she had loved to sit in gardens and talk, the kind of long, rambling conversations we'd had our whole lives, the kind that go from practical to philosophical to purely personal without any of those transitions being marked, the kind you can only have with someone who has known you long enough to follow every reference without explanation. I missed her with a specific quality of ache that I had come to understand was not going to diminish into nothing, only into something more manageable. Grief does not resolve. It just becomes part of the landscape, like the oak tree, like the shape of the rooms, present without dominating. I talked to her sometimes when I was alone in the garden. Not prayer, just talking, the way you talk to someone who shaped you when you want to remember the shape they gave you. I said things like, "You were right about Nathan," and "You would have hated Vanessa, and you would have been too polite to say so." And "I think I'm going to be okay. Not the way I was before, but okay in a different way. Harder in some places. Softer in others." I thought she would have had opinions about that. She always had opinions. I thought she would have said something like, "Harder and softer at the same time is exactly right, Evelyn. That's what surviving does when you let it." In September, Patricia called to tell me that the recovery of the items sold through the online resale platform had been partially successful. The silver mirror had been located and was being returned to me through the legal process. The first edition books had been sold to a private buyer who, upon being contacted through the platform, had agreed to return them in exchange for the documented purchase price. That was more than I had expected. I had not expected the books. The jewelry box was not recovered. It was the only item that remained unaccounted for, and at a certain point Patricia told me gently that the trail had gone cold, and we may have reached the end of what was locatable. I thanked her for everything she had done. I sat with the loss of the jewelry box for several days. Then I did something I had been thinking about for months. I went to a small woodworking shop across town, run by a man who had been recommended to me by Dorothy, who knew everyone worth knowing within a 20-mile radius. His name was Franklin. He was in his 70s, and he made things from wood in a workshop behind his house that smelled like sawdust and linseed oil and something ineffably warm. I brought him a photograph of the original box. I had one from an old family photo that showed my dresser in the background, and I brought him a piece of paper on which I had written Raymond's inscription. "For my Evelyn. Always." I told him what I wanted. He listened without interrupting, the same quality of listening I had come to value deeply in people, the kind that doesn't rush to respond. "I can do that," he said. "Cherry wood, 2 months. "Thank you," I said. "You want the inscription inside the lid?" "Yes." His handwriting was like this. I showed him a scan of a letter Raymond had written me, from early in our marriage, which I had kept in a separate place from the jewelry box, by chance or luck or whatever unglamorous thing prevents you from losing everything at once. Franklin looked at it carefully. "I'll do my best," he said. 2 months later, I drove back to his workshop and he handed me a box that was not Raymond's box. It was different wood, different dimensions, different proportions. But it was made with the same care, by a man who had understood what I was asking for even though I hadn't fully said it, and inside the lid, burned into the wood in a hand that approximated but did not replicate Raymond's. "For my Evelyn. Always." I held it in the workshop for a long moment. Franklin did not say anything. He turned back to his workbench and let me have the moment, which was exactly the right thing to do. "How much?" I said when I could. He named a price that was less than I expected. "That's not enough," I said. "That's what I charge," he said without turning around. I paid it, and I brought the box home and put it on my dresser, and I stood there looking at it for a while, and I thought, some things that are lost cannot be replaced, but some things that are lost can be honored. And honoring them is not the same as pretending nothing happened, but it is something. It is not nothing. The anniversary of Margaret's burial fell in October. I went to the cemetery early in the morning, before it was crowded, and I brought white carnations because those were hers, always hers. And I stood at her grave in the October air, and I told her everything that had happened since I'd stood here a year ago. I told her about the lawn, the storage room, the bank statements. I told her about Daniel and Patricia and the green notebook with 23 pages. I told her about the dining room table and Vanessa's face in the garden and Nathan's face when he finally understood. I told her about the hospital room in Clara's hands and Michael driving through the night. I told her about the settlement and the mirror coming back and the box Franklin made. And then I told her the things that weren't in any legal document, the things I had learned. I told her that I had spent too many years treating patience as a virtue without asking what I was being patient for. That I had confused keeping the peace with keeping myself, and those are not the same thing, and the confusion cost me in ways I was still calculating. I told her that I had let the people I loved treat silence as consent, and that from now on silence would be silence. It would not be permission, it would not be forgiveness, it would not be agreement. If I was not all right with something, I intended to say so. I was 68 years old, and I had earned the right to say so. And if that made some people uncomfortable, then they would simply have to be uncomfortable. I told her that I had also learned something about love that I thought I'd understood, but had only partially understood. Love is not the same as being needed. I had built so much of my sense of purpose around being needed, by my children, by the household, by the machine of family life that requires someone to keep it running, that I had confused being needed with being loved, and when the needing shifted or diminished or turned into something darker, I hadn't known how to hold my place without it. I knew now. Your place is not earned by usefulness. Your place exists because you exist. Because you are a person with a history and a name and a pair of hands that built something real over 68 years, and that is sufficient. And anyone who treats it as insufficient has made an error about value that is their error, not yours. I told Margaret I was still working on believing that completely. That some mornings I woke up and the old voice was still there, the one that calculated worth by output. But I was working on it. I thought she would approve of the working on it, even if the finish line was not in sight. I drove home from the cemetery, and I made lunch, and I sat at the kitchen table and I wrote a letter. I had been thinking about writing the letter for a while, turning over the idea, deciding against it, returning to it. It was a letter to no one in particular, or to anyone who needed it. I don't know exactly why I wrote it, except that I had spent the past year gathering information and building a case, and speaking in the careful, specific language of legal documentation, and there was something in me that needed to speak in a different register, something personal, something that said what all of that had meant. I wrote for 2 hours. The letter was not tidy. It went in several directions and came back. I didn't edit it much. When I was done, I read it once, and then I folded it and put it in the drawer of my nightstand, beside the things that mattered. It said things like, "The most dangerous lie I ever believed was that keeping quiet was the same as being kind. It is not. Sometimes keeping quiet is just fear in a better dress." It said, "If someone is taking from you while smiling, the smile is part of the taking. Don't thank them for the smile." It said, "Your age is not your weakness, it is your accumulation. And everything you have accumulated, every hard year, everything you survived, every version of yourself you had to become to get through what was in front of you, is yours. Nobody can take it without your permission, and you don't have to give permission." It said, "The people who love you will stay. The ones who are using you will eventually reveal it if you stay awake and pay attention. The hardest part is staying awake when it would be so much easier to sleep." It said, "I almost lost my house. I almost lost my health. I almost lost my children's trust in me, which would have been the loss I could least have borne. I did not lose any of those things in the end, but I came close enough to feel the edge of it, and that edge changed me. I think I needed to be changed. I think I had been living a little too close to the edge of disappearing without knowing it, and the crisis pushed me back toward myself in a way that nothing gentler would have." It said, "Love your people hard and honestly. Tell them the truth even when it is uncomfortable. Set the boundary even when you are afraid it will cost you something, because the boundaries you don't set will cost you everything." And at the end it said, "I am 68 years old. I stood in my garden this morning and the roses were blooming, the ones I cut back in the fall that everyone, including me, was not sure would come back. They came back. Everything that is built right and intended properly comes back. That is not optimism. That is just how living things work." I did not expect to read that letter to anyone. I wrote it for myself, to settle something in my own chest that needed settling. But I'm telling you now, because that is what this story is for. Not to say that everything ended cleanly, because it did not. Not to say that Nathan is restored and the family is healed and the wound has closed without a scar, because none of that would be accurate. The scar is there. It will always be there. What I'm saying is that what is on the other side of the wound is real. The garden is real. The Saturday mornings are real. The roses came back. And the woman standing in that garden, the one they threw away, the one they expected to fold and disappear and accept whatever diminished space they assigned her, that woman is still here. She is still here, and she knows her own name, and she knows what she built, and she knows what she is worth. That, in the end, is what they never managed to take. I want to speak to you directly now because I have been holding this story the entire time, and stories like this one are not only mine. If you are watching this and you recognize something in what happened to Evelyn Harper, if you have felt yourself quietly disappearing from your own life while the people around you rearranged the furniture and told you what you needed and signed things you didn't fully read and managed what you were allowed to know, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not confused. You are not oversensitive. You are not making something out of nothing. What you are doing is noticing something real, and noticing is the first step toward the only thing that helps, which is paying attention. Pay attention to what is being taken, to what you are being told you need to accept, to the small compressions, the redirected conversations, the gentle adjustments that individually seem manageable and collectively amount to your erasure. Pay attention to your own discomfort, because your discomfort is information. It is your body's way of telling you that something does not add up, and it is almost always right. You are allowed to ask questions. You are allowed to get a second opinion. You are allowed to call an attorney at 2:30 in the morning and leave a 4-minute voicemail without apologizing for the hour, because some things cannot wait for a more convenient time. You are allowed to be difficult. You are allowed to be the person who does not smooth things over, who does not absorb the friction so others don't have to feel it, who does not maintain a composure that primarily benefits the people who are hoping you won't make a scene. Make the scene. Calmly, precisely, with documentation if you have it. But make it. And if you are caring for an older person in your life, a parent, a neighbor, someone who has lived long enough to have accumulated things worth protecting, pay attention to who else is paying attention to what they have. Check in. Ask the questions they might not think to ask you. The people who exploit the elderly count on the rest of the family being too busy, too distant, too uncomfortable to look closely. Be the person who looks closely. It is not a betrayal of trust to pay attention. It is how love actually functions, in practice, when the stakes are real. And to the woman who is 68, or 73, or 81, who has spent her whole life giving and managing and holding things together and has recently been made to feel that her needs are an inconvenience and her presence is a burden, and her age has made her something less than what she was, I want to say this specifically to you. Your age is not your diminishment. It is your credential. Every year you have lived is a year of information, of experience, of survival, of learning. You are not less of a person because you are older. You are more of one. And any arrangement that asks you to accept less space, less dignity, less acknowledgement, less control over the things you built and earned and own, is an arrangement you are allowed to refuse. You are allowed to refuse. You do not have to accept the storage room. You do not have to be grateful for what is being taken from you under the guise of care. You do not have to make peace with a situation that is not peaceful. Pick up the phone. Write it down. Find someone who will listen. And do not stop until someone does. I am Evelyn Harper. I am 68 years old. I buried my sister. I lost my footing. I spent weeks in a storage room in my own house gathering evidence of my own exploitation. I nearly broke my health, and I came back. My garden is growing. My name is on the deed. My children know where I live, and they come when I call, and they stay as long as I need them. And this morning I stood in the yard in the October light with a cup of coffee that had gone slightly cold because I'd forgotten it while I was looking at the roses. And the oak tree was the particular shade of amber. It gets in autumn, and the whole thing, the house, the garden, the morning, the ordinary unremarkable fact of still being here, felt like something I had earned. Not because I won a legal case, not because I outmaneuvered someone who tried to take from me, but because I refused to disappear. That is the thing they could never take, even when they took everything else. The decision to stay present, to keep paying attention, to remain stubbornly and fully yourself. They threw me away. I came back, and I am not leaving again.